Chapter 14 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 14. The next morning, Miki set out again for the trapline of Jacques Le Beau. It was not the thought of food easily secured that tempted him. There would have been a great thrill in killing for himself. It was the trail, with its smell of the man-beast, that drew him like a magnet. Where that smell was very strong he wanted to lie down and wait. Yet with his desire there was also fear and a steadily growing caution. He did not tamper with the first kekek, nor with the second. At the third Le Beau had fumbled in the placing of his bait, and for that reason the little ball of fat was strong with the scent of his hands. A fox would have turned away from it quickly. Miki, however, drew it from the peg and dropped it in the snow between his forefeet. Then he looked about him and listened for a full minute. After that he licked the ball of fat with his tongue. The scent of Le Beau's hands kept him from swallowing it as he had swallowed the caribou meat. A little suspiciously he crushed it slowly between his jaws. The fat was sweet. He was about to gulp it down when he detected another and less pleasant taste, and what remained in his mouth he spat out upon the snow. But the acrid bite of the poison remained upon his tongue and in his throat. It crept deeper, and he caught up a mouthful of snow and swallowed it to put out the burning sensation that was crawling nearer to his vitals. Had he devoured the ball of fat as he had eaten the other baits, he would have been dead within a quarter of an hour, and Le Beau would not have gone far to find his body. As it was, he was beginning to turn sick at the end of 15 minutes. A premonition of the evil that was upon him drew him off the trail and in the direction of the windfall. He had gone only a short distance when suddenly his legs gave way under him and he fell. He began to shiver. Every muscle in his body trembled. His teeth clicked. His eyes grew wide, and it was impossible for him to move. And then, like a hand throttling him, there came a strange stiffness in the back of his neck, and his breath hissed chokingly out of his throat. The stiffness passed like a wave of fire through his body. Where his muscles had trembled and shivered a moment before, they now became rigid and lifeless. The throttling grip of the poison at the base of his brain drew his head back until his muzzle was pointed straight up to the sky. Still he made no cry. For a space every nerve in his body was at the point of death. Then came the change. As though a string had snapped, the horrible grip left the back of his neck, the stiffness shot out of his body in a flood of shivering cold, and in another moment he was twisting and tearing up the snow in mad convulsions. The spasm lasted for perhaps a minute. When it was over Miki was panting. Streams of saliva dripped from his jaws into the snow. But he was alive. Death had missed him by a hair, and after a little he staggered to his feet and continued on his way to the windfall. Thereafter Jacques Le Beau might place 1,000,000 poison capsules in his way, and he would not touch them. Never again would he steal the meat from a bait peg. 2 days later Le Beau saw where Miki had fought his fight with death in the snow, and his heart was black with rage and disappointment. He began to follow the footprints of the dog. It was noon when he came to the windfall and saw the beaten path where Miki entered it. On his knees he peered into the cavernous depths, and saw nothing. But Miki, lying watchfully, saw the man, and he was like the black, bearded monster who had almost killed him with a club a long time ago. And in his heart, too, there was disappointment. For away back in his memory of things There was always the thought of Challoner, the master he had lost, and it was never Challoner whom he found when he came upon the man smell. Le Beau heard his growl, and the man's blood leaped excitedly as he rose to his feet. He could not go in after the wild dog, but he could not lure him out. But there was another way. He would drive him out with fire. Deep back in his fortress, Miki heard the crunch of Le Beau's feet in the snow. A few minutes later he saw the man beast again peering into his lair. "Bete! Bete!" he called half tauntingly, and again Miki growled. Jacques was satisfied. The windfall was not more than 30 or 40 feet in diameter, and about it the forest was open and clear of undergrowth. It would be impossible for the wild dog to get away from his rifle. A second time he went around the piled up mass of fallen timber. On 3 sides it was completely smothered under the deep snow. Only where Miki's trail entered was it open. Getting the wind behind him, Le Beau made his ISKOO of birch bark and dry wood at the far end of the windfall. The seasoned logs and tree tops caught the fire like tinder, and within a few minutes the flames began to crackle and roar in a manner that made Miki wonder what was happening. For a space the smoke did not reach him. Le Beau, watching, with his rifle in his bare hands, did not for an instant let his eyes leave the spot where the wild dog must come out. Suddenly a pungent whiff of smoke filled Miki's nostrils, and a thin white cloud crept in a ghostly veil between him and the opening. A crawling, snake-like rope of it began to pour between 2 logs within a yard of him, and with it the strange roaring grew nearer and more menacing. Then, for the first time, he saw lightning flashes of yellow flame through the tangled débris as the fire ate into the heart of a mass of pitch-filled spruce. In another 10 seconds the flames leaped 20 feet into the air, and Jacques Le Beau stood with his rifle half to his shoulder, ready to kill. Appalled by the danger that was upon him, Miki did not forget Le Beau. With an instinct sharpened to fox-like keenness, his mind leaped instantly to the truth of the matter. It was the man beast who had set his new enemy upon him. And out there, just beyond the opening, the man beast was waiting. So, like the fox, he did what Le Beau least expected. He crawled back swiftly through the tangled tops until he came to the wall of snow that shut the windfall in, and through this he burrowed his way almost as quickly as the fox himself would have done it. With his jaws he tore through the half-inch outer crust, and a moment later stood in the open with the fire between him and Le Beau. The windfall was a blazing furnace, and suddenly Le Beau ran back a dozen steps so that he could see on the farther side. 100 yards away he saw Miki making for the deeper forest. It was a clear shot. At that distance Le Beau would have staked his life that it was impossible for him to miss. He did not hurry. 1 shot and it would be over. He raised his rifle, and in that instant a wisp of smoke came like the lash of a whip with the wind and caught him fairly in the eyes, and his bullet passed 3 inches over Miki's head. The whining snarl of it was a new thing to Miki. But he recognized the thunder of the gun, and he knew what a gun could do. To Le Beau, still firing at him through the merciful cloud of smoke, he was like a grey streak flashing to the thick timber. 3 times more Le Beau fired. From the edge of a dense clump of spruce, Miki flung back a defiant howl. He disappeared as Le Beau's last shot shovelled up the snow at his heels. The narrowness of his escape from the man beast did not frighten Miki out of the Jackson's Knee country. If anything, it held him more closely to it. It gave him something to think about besides Neewa and his aloneness. As the fox returns to peer stealthily upon the deadfall that has almost caught him, so the trapline was possessed now of a new thrill for Miki. Heretofore the man smell had held for him only a vague significance. Now it marked the presence of a real and concrete danger. And he welcomed it. His wits were sharpened. The fascination of the trapline was deadlier than before. From the burned windfall he made a wide detour to a point where Le Beau's snowshoe trail entered the edge of the swamp, and here, hidden in a thick clump of bushes, he watched him as he travelled homeward half an hour later. From that day he hung like a grim, grey ghost on the trapline. Silent-footed, cautious, always on the alert for the danger which threatened him, he haunted Jacques Le Beau's thoughts and footsteps with the elusive persistence of a werewolf, a loup garou of the Black Forest. Twice in the next week Le Beau caught a flash of him. 3 times he heard him howl. And twice he followed his trail until, in despair and exhaustion, he turned back. Never was Miki caught unaware. He ate no more baits in the trap houses. Even when Le Beau lured him with the whole carcass of a rabbit, he would not touch it, nor would he touch a rabbit frozen dead in a snare. From Le Beau's traps he took only the living things, chiefly birds and squirrels, and the big web-footed snowshoe rabbits. And because a mink jumped at him once and tore open his nose, he destroyed a number of minks so utterly that their pelts were spoiled. He found himself another windfall, but instinct taught him now never to go to it directly, but to approach it and leave it in a roundabout way. Day and night Le Beau, the man brute, plotted against him. He set many poison baits. He killed a doe and scattered strychnine in its entrails. He built deadfalls and baited them with meat soaked in boiling fat. He made himself a blind of spruce and cedar boughs and sat for long hours, watching with his rifle. And still Miki was the victor. One day Miki found a huge fisher cat in one of the traps. He had not forgotten the battle of long ago with Oochak, the other fisher cat, or the whipping he had received. But there was no thought of vengeance in his heart on the early evening he became acquainted with Oochak the Second. Usually he was in his windfall at dusk, but this afternoon a great and devouring loneliness had held him on the trail. The spirit of Kuskayitum, the hand of the mating god, was pressing heavily upon him. The consuming desire of flesh and blood for the companionship of other flesh and blood. It burned in his veins like a fever. It took away from him all thought of hunger or of the hunt. In his soul was a vast unfilled yearning. It was then that he came upon Oochak. Perhaps it was the same Oochak of months ago. If so, he had grown even as Miki had grown. He was splendid, with his long silken fur and his sleek body, and he was not struggling, but sat awaiting his fate without excitement. To Miki he looked warm and soft and comfortable. It made him think of Neewa and the 101 nights they had slept together. His desire leaped out to Oochak. He whined softly as he advanced. He would make friends. Even with Oochak, his old enemy, he would lie down in peace and happiness, so great was the gnawing emptiness in his heart. Oochak made no response, nor did he move, but sat furred up like a huge, soft ball, watching Miki as he crept nearer on his belly. Something of the old puppishness came back into the dog. He wriggled and thumped his tail, and as he whined again he seemed to say, "Let's forget the old trouble, Oochak. Let's be friends. I've got a fine windfall, and I'll kill you a rabbit." And still Oochak did not move or make a sound. At last Miki could almost reach out with his forepaws and touch him. He dragged himself still nearer, and his tail thumped harder. "And I'll get you out of the trap," he may have been saying. "It's the man beast's trap, and I hate him." And then, so suddenly that Miki had no chance to guard himself, Oochak sprang the length of the trap chain and was at him. With teeth and razor-edged claws he tore deep gashes in Miki's nose. Even then the blood of battle rose slowly in him, and he might have retreated had not Oochak's teeth got a hold in his shoulder. With a roar he tried to shake himself free, but Oochak held on. Then his jaws snapped at the back of the fisher cat's neck. When he was done, Oochak was dead. He slunk away, but in him there was no more the thrill of the victor. He had killed, but in killing he had found no joy. Upon him, the four-footed beast, had fallen at last the oppression of the thing that drives men mad. He stood in the heart of a vast world, and for him that world was empty. He was an outcast. His heart crying out for comradeship, he found that all things feared him or hated him. He was a pariah, a wanderer without a friend or a home. He did not reason these things, but the gloom of them settled upon him like black night. He did not return to his windfall. In a little open he sat on his haunches, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars as they came out. There was an early moon, and as it came up over the forest, a great throbbing red disk that seemed filled with life, he howled mournfully in the face of it. He wandered out into a big burn a little later, and there the night was like day, so clear that his shadow followed him and all other things about him cast shadows. And then, all at once, he caught in the night wind a sound which he had heard many times before. It came from far away, and it was like a whisper at first, an echo of strange voices riding on the wind. 100 times he had heard that cry of the wolves. Since Mahigun, the she-wolf, had gashed his shoulder so fiercely away back in the days of his puppyhood, he had evaded the path of that cry. He had learned, in a way, to hate it. But he could not wipe out entirely the thrill that came with that call of the blood. And tonight it rode over all his fear and hatred. Out there was company. Whence the cry came, the wild brethren were running 2 by 2, and 3 by 3, and there was comradeship. His body quivered. An answering cry rose in his throat, dying away in a whine, and for an hour after that he heard no more of the wolf cry in the wind. The pack had swung to the west, so far away that their voices were lost. And it passed, with the moon straight over them, close to the shack of Pierrot, the half-breed. In Pierrot's cabin was a white man, on his way to Fort o' God. He saw that Pierrot crossed himself and muttered. "It is the mad pack," explained Pierrot then. "Monsieur, they have been Keskwao since the beginning of the new moon. In them are the spirits of devils." He opened the cabin door a little, so that the mad cry of the beasts came to them plainly. When he closed it there was in his eyes a look of strange fear. "Now and then the wolves go like that, Keskwao, stark mad, in the dead of winter," he shuddered. "3 days ago there were 20 of them, monsieur, for I saw them with my own eyes, and counted their tracks in the snow. Since then they have been murdered and torn into strings by the others of the pack. Listen to them ravin'. Can you tell me why, monsieur? Can you tell me why wolves sometimes go mad in the heart of winter when there is no heat or rotten meat to turn them sick? No? But I can tell you. They are the loup-garous. In their bodies ride the spirits of devils, and there they will ride until the bodies die. For the wolves that go mad in the deep snows always die, monsieur. That is the strange part of it. They die." And then it was, swinging eastward from the cabin of Pierrot, that the mad wolves of Jackson's Knee came into the country of the big swamp wherein trees bore the double X blaze of Jacques Le Beau's axe. There were 14 of them running in the moonlight. What it is that now and then drives a wolf pack mad in the dead of winter, no man yet has wholly learned. Possibly it begins with a bad wolf, just as a bad sledge dog, nipping and biting his fellows, will spread his distemper among them until the team becomes an ugly, quarrelsome horde. Such a dog the wise driver kills or turns loose. The wolves that bore down upon Le Beau's country were red-eyed and thin. Their bodies were covered with gashes, and the mouths of some frothed blood. They did not run as wolves run for meat. They were a sinister and suspicious lot, with a sneaking droop to their haunches, and their cry was not the deep-throated cry of the hunt pack, but a ravening clamour that seemed to have no leadership or cause. Scarcely was the sound of their tongues gone beyond the hearing of Pierrot's ears than one of the thin grey beasts rubbed against the shoulder of another, and the second turned with the swiftness of a snake, like the bad dog of the traces, and struck his fangs deep into the first wolf's flesh. Could Pierrot have seen, he would have understood then how the 4 he had found had come to their end. Swift as the snap of a whiplash, the fight between the two was on. The other 12 of the pack stopped. They came back, circling in cautiously and grimly silent about their fighting comrades. They ranged themselves in a ring, as men gather about a fistic battle, and there they waited, their jaws drooling, their fangs clicking, a low and eager whining smothered in their throats. And then the thing happened. One of the fighting wolves went down. He was on his back, and the end came. The 12 wolves were upon him as one, and, like those Pierrot had seen, he was torn to pieces and his flesh devoured. After that the 13 went on deeper into Le Beau's country. Miki heard them again, after that hour's interval of silence. Farther and farther he had wandered from the forest. He had crossed the burn and was in the open plain, with the rough ridges cutting through and the big river at the edge of it. It was not so gloomy out here, and his loneliness weighed upon him less heavily than in the deep timber. And across this plain came the voice of the wolves. He did not move away from it tonight. He waited, silhouetted against the vivid starlight at the crest of a rocky knoll, and the top of this knoll was so small that another could not have stood beside him without their shoulders touching. On all sides of him the plain swept away in the white light of the stars and moon. Never had the desire to respond to the wild brethren urged itself upon him more fiercely than now. He flung back his head until his black-tipped muzzle pointed up to the stars and the voice rolled out of his throat. But it was only half a howl. Even then, oppressed by his great loneliness, there gripped him that something instinctive which warned him against betrayal. After that he remained quiet, and as the wolves drew nearer his body grew tense, his muscles hardened, and in his throat there was the low whispering of a snarl instead of a howl. He sensed danger. He had caught, in the voice of the wolves, the ravening note that had made Pierrot cross himself and mutter of the loup garou, and he crouched down on his belly at the top of the rocky mound. Then he saw them. They were sweeping like dark and swiftly moving shadows between him and the forest. Suddenly they stopped, and for a few moments no sound came from them as they packed themselves closely on the scent of his fresh trail in the snow. And then they surged in his direction. This time there was still fiercer madness in the wild cry that rose from their throats. In a dozen seconds they were at the mound. They swept around it and past it, all save one, a huge gray brute who shot up the hillock straight at the prey the others had not yet seen. There was a snarl in Miki's throat as he came. Once more he was facing the thrill of a great fight. Once more the blood ran suddenly hot in his veins, and fear was driven from him as the wind drives smoke from a fire. If Neewa were only there now, to fend at his back while he fought in front. He stood up on his feet. He met the uprushing pack brute head to head. Their jaws clashed, and the wild wolf found jaws at last that crunched through his own as if they had been a whelp's bone. And he rolled and twisted back to the plain in a dying agony. But not until another gray form had come to fill his place. Into the throat of this second Miki drove his fangs as the wolf came over the crest. It was the slashing, sabre-like stroke of the North dog, and the throat of the wolf was torn open and the blood poured out as if emptied by the blade of a knife. Down he plunged to join the first, and in that instant the pack swept up and over Miki, and he was smothered under the mass of their bodies. Had 2 or 3 attacked him at once, he would have died as quickly as the first 2 of his enemies had come to their end. Numbers had saved him in the first rush. On the level of the plain he would have been torn into pieces like a bit of cloth, but on the space at the top of the kopje, no larger than the top of a table, he was lost for a few seconds under the snarling and rending horde of his enemies. Fangs intended for him sank into the other wolf flesh. The madness of the pack became a blind rage, and the assault upon Miki turned into a slaughter of the wolves themselves. On his back, held down by the weight of bodies, Miki drove his fangs again and again into flesh. A pair of jaws seized him in the groin, and a shock of agony swept through him. It was a death grip, sinking steadily into his vitals. Just in time another pair of jaws seized the wolf who held him, and the hold in his groin gave way. In that moment Miki felt himself plunging down the steep side of the knoll, and after him came a half of what was left alive of the pack. The fighting devils in Miki's brain gave way all at once to that cunning of the fox which had served him even more than claw and fang in times of great danger. Scarcely had he reached the plain before he was on his feet, and no sooner had he touched his feet than he was off like the wind in direction of the river. He had gained a 50-yard start before the first of the wolves discovered his flight. There were only 8 that followed him now. Of the 13 mad beasts, 5 were dead or dying at the foot of the hillock. Of these Miki had slain 2. The others had fallen at the fangs of their own brethren. Half a mile away were the steep cliffs of the river, and at the edge of these cliffs was a great cairn of rocks in which for one night Miki had sought shelter. He had not forgotten the tunnel into the tumbled mass of rock debris, nor how easily it could be defended from within. Once in that tunnel he would turn in the door of it and slaughter his enemies one by one, for only one by one could they attack him. but he had not reckoned with that huge gray form behind him that might have been named Lightning, the fiercest and swiftest of all the mad wolves of the pack. He sped ahead of his slower footed companions like a streak of light, and Miki had made but half the distance to the cairn when he heard the panting breath of Lightning behind him. Even Hela, his father, could not have run more swiftly than Miki, but, great as Miki's speed, Lightning ran more swiftly. 2/3 of the distance to the cliff, and the huge wolf's muzzle was at Miki's flank. With a burst of speed Miki gained a little. Then steadily Lightning drew abreast of him, a grim and merciless shadow of doom. 100 yards farther on, and a little to the right, was the cairn. But Miki could not run to the right without turning into Lightning's jaws, and he realized now that if he reached the cairn his enemy would be upon him before he could dive into the tunnel and face about. To stop and fight would be death, for behind he could hear the other wolves. 10 seconds more, and the chasm of the river yawned ahead of them. At its very brink Miki swung and struck at Lightning. He sensed death now, and in the face of death all his hatred turned upon the one beast that had run at his side. In an instant they were down. 2 yards from the edge of the cliff, and Miki's jaws were at Lightning's throat when the pack rushed upon them. They were swept onward. The earth flew out from under their feet, and they were in space. Grimly Miki held to the throat of his foe. Over and over they twisted in mid-air, and then came a terrific shock. Lightning was under. Yet so great was the shock that, even though the wolf's huge body was under him like a cushion, Miki was stunned and dazed. A minute passed before he staggered to his feet. Lightning lay still, the life smashed out of him. A little beyond him lay the bodies of 2 other wolves that in their wild rush had swept over the cliff. Miki looked up. Between him and the stars he could see the top of the cliff, a vast distance above him. One after the other he smelled at the bodies of the 3 dead wolves. Then he limped slowly along the base of the cliff until he came to a fissure between 2 huge rocks. Into this he crept and lay down, licking his wounds. After all, there were worse things in the world than Le Beau's trap line. Perhaps there were even worse things than men. After a time he stretched his great head out between his forepaws, and slowly the starlight grew dimmer, and the snow less white, and he slept. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. In a twist of Three Jack Pine River, buried in the deep of the forest between the Shamattawa country and Hudson Bay, was the cabin in which lived Jacques Le Beau, the trapper. There was not another man in all that wilderness who was the equal of Le Beau in wickedness, unless it was Durant, who hunted foxes 100 miles north, and who was Jacques' rival in several things. A giant in size, with a heavy, sullen face, and eyes which seemed but half-hidden greenish loopholes for the pitiless soul within him, if he had a soul at all, Le Beau was a throwback of the worst sort. In their shacks and teepees the Indians whispered softly that all the devils of his forebears had gathered in him. It was a grim kind of fate that had given to Le Beau a wife. Had she been a witch, an evil-doer and an evil-thinker like himself, the thing would not have been such an abortion of what should have been. But she was not that. Sweet-faced, with something of unusual beauty still in her pale cheeks and starving eyes, trembling at his approach and a slave in his presence, she was, like his dogs, the property of the Brute. And the woman had a baby. One had already died, and it was the thought that this one might die, as the other had died, that brought at times the new flash of fire into her dark eyes. "Le bon Dieu! I pray to the blessed angels, I swear you shall live!" she would cry to it at times, hugging it close to her breast. And it was at these times that the fire came into her eyes, and her pale cheeks flushed with a smouldering bit of the flame that had once been her beauty. Some day, some day! But she never finished, even to the child, what was in her mind. Sometimes her dreams were filled with visions. The world was still young, and she was not old. She was thinking of that as she stood before the cracked bit of mirror in the cabin, brushing out her hair, that was black and shining, and so long that it fell to her hips. Of her beauty her hair had remained. It was defiant of the Brute. And deep back in her eyes and in her face there were still the living, hidden traces of her girlhood heritage, ready to bloom again if Fate, mending its error at last, would only take away for ever the crushing presence of the master. She stood a little longer before the bit of glass when she heard the crunching of footsteps in the snow outside. Swiftly what had been in her face was gone. Le Beau had been away on his trapline since yesterday, and his return filled her with the old dread. Twice he had caught her before the mirror, and had called her vile names for wasting her time in admiring herself when she might have been scraping the fat from his pelts. The second time he had sent her reeling back against the wall, and had broken the mirror until the bit she treasured now was not much larger than her two slim hands. She would not be caught again. She ran with the glass to the place where she kept it in hiding, and then quickly she wove the heavy strands of her hair into a braid. The strange, dead look of fear and foreboding closed like a veil over the secrets her eyes had disclosed to herself. She turned, as she always turned in her woman's hope and yearning, to greet him when he entered. The Brute entered, a dark and surly monster. He was in a wicked humour. His freshly caught furs he flung to the floor. He pointed to them, and his eyes were narrowed to menacing slits as they fell upon her. "He was there again, that devil!" he growled. "See, he has spoiled the fisher, and he has cleaned out my baits and knocked down the trap houses. Par les mi cornes du diable, but I will kill him. I have sworn to cut him into bits with a knife when I catch him, and catch him I will, tomorrow. See to it there, the skins, when you have got me something to eat. Mend the fisher where he is torn in two, and cover the seam well with fat, so that the agent over at the post will not discover it is bad. Tonnerre de Dieu, that brat! Why do you always keep his squalling until I come in? Answer me, Bete!" Such was his greeting. He flung his snowshoes into a corner, stamped the snow off his feet, and got himself a fresh plug of black tobacco from a shelf over the stove. Then he went out again, leaving the woman with a cold tremble in her heart and the wan desolation of hopelessness in her face as she set about getting him food. From the cabin Le Beau went to his dog pit, a corral of saplings with a shelter shack in the centre of it. It was the Brute's boast that he had the fiercest pack of sled dogs between Hudson Bay and the Athabasca. It was his chief quarrel with Durant, his rival farther north, and his ambition was to breed a pup that would kill the fighting husky which Durant brought down to the post with him each winter at New Year. This season he had chosen Netah, the Killer, for the big fight at God's Lake. On the day he would gamble his money and his reputation against Durant's, his dog would be just 1 month under 2 years of age. It was Netah he called from out of the pack now. The dog slunk to him with a low growl in his throat, and for the first time something like joy shone in Le Beau's face. He loved to hear that growl. He loved to see the red and treacherous glow in Netah's eyes, and hear the menacing click of his jaws. Whatever of nobility might have been in Netah's blood had been clubbed out by the man. They were alike, in that their souls were dead. And Netah, for a dog, was a devil. For that reason Le Beau had chosen him to fight the big fight. Le Beau looked down at him, and drew a deep breath of satisfaction. "Ah, but you are looking fine, Netah," he exulted. "I can almost see running blood in those devil eyes of yours. Oui, red blood that smells and runs, as the blood of Durant's puss shall run when you sink those teeth in its jugular. And to morrow we are going to give you the test, such a beautiful test, with the wild dog that is robbing my traps and tearing my fishers into bits. For I will catch him, and you shall fight him until he is almost dead. And then I shall cut his heart out alive, as I have promised, and you will eat it while it is still beating, so that there will be no excuse for your losing to that puss which Monsieur Durant will bring down. Comprenez? It will be a beautiful test, to-morrow. And if you fail I will kill you. Oui, if you so much as let a whimper out of you, I will kill you, dead." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. That same night, 10 miles to the west, Miki slept under a windfall of logs and tree tops not more than half a mile from Le Beau's trapline. In the early dawn, when Le Beau left his cabin, accompanied by Netah, the Killer, Miki came out from under his windfall, after a night of troublous dreams. He had dreamed of those first weeks after he had lost his master, when Neewa was always at his side, and the visions that had come to him filled him with an uneasiness and a loneliness that made him whine as he stood watching the dark shadows fading away before the coming of day. Could Le Beau have seen him there, as the first of the cold sun struck upon him, the words which he had repeated over and over to the Killer would have stuck in his throat. For at 11 months of age Miki was a young giant of his breed. He weighed 60 pounds, and none of that 60 was fat. His body was as slim and as lean as a wolf's. His chest was massive, and over it the muscles rolled like babiche cord when he moved. His legs were like the legs of Hela, the big Mackenzie hound who was his father, and with his jaws he could crack a caribou bone as Le Beau might have cracked it with a stone. For 8 of the 11 months of his life the wilderness had been his master. It had tempered him to the hardness of living steel. It had wrought him without abeyance to age in the mould of its pitiless schooling, had taught him to fight for his life, to kill that he might live, and to use his brain before he used his jaws. He was as powerful as Netah, the Killer, who was twice his age, and with his strength he possessed a cunning and a quickness which the Killer would never know. Thus had the raw wilderness prepared him for this day. As the sun fired up the forest with a cold flame, Miki set off in direction of Le Beau's trapline. He came to where Le Beau had passed yesterday and sniffed suspiciously of the man smell that was still strong in the snowshoe tracks. He had become accustomed to this smell, but he had not lost his suspicion of it. It was repugnant to him, even as it fascinated him. It filled him with an inexplicable fear, and yet he found himself powerless to run away from it. 3 times in the last 10 days he had seen the man brute himself. Once he had been hiding within a dozen yards of Le Beau when he passed. This morning he headed straight for the swamp through which Le Beau's traps were set. There the rabbits were thickest, and it was in the swamp that they most frequently got in Jacques' caquecs, the little houses he built of sticks and cedar boughs to keep the snow off his baits. They were so numerous that they were a pest, and each time that Le Beau made his trip over the line he found at least 2 of every 3 traps sprung by them, and therefore made useless for the catching of fur. But where there were many rabbits there were also fishers and lynx, and in spite of the rage which the plague of rabbits sent him into, Le Beau continued to set his traps there. And now, in addition to the rabbits, he had the wild dog to contend with. His heart was fired by a vengeful anticipation as he hurried on through the glow of the early sun, with the killer at his heels, led by a babiche thong. Miki was nosing about the first trap house as Netah and Le Beau entered the edge of the swamp, 3 miles to the east. It was in this caquec that Miki had killed the fisher cat the previous morning. It was empty now. Even the bait peg was gone, and there was no sign of a trap. A quarter of a mile farther on he came to a second trap house, and this also was empty. He was a bit puzzled. And then he went on to the third house. He stood for several minutes, sniffing the air still more suspiciously, before he drew close to it. The man tracks were thicker here. The snow was beaten down with them, and the scent of Le Beau was so strong in the air that for a space Miki believed he was near. Then he advanced so that he got a look into the door of the trap house. Squatted there, staring at him with big round eyes, was a huge snowshoe rabbit. A premonition of danger held Miki back. It was something in the attitude of Wapoos, the old rabbit. He was not like the others he had caught along Le Beau's line. He was not struggling in a trap. He was not stretched out, half frozen, and he was not dangling at the end of a snare. He was all furred up into a warm and comfortable-looking ball. As a matter of fact, Le Beau had caught him with his hands in a hollow log, and had tied him to the bait peg with a piece of buckskin string, and after that, just out of Wapoos's reach, he had set a nest of traps and covered them with snow. Nearer and nearer to this menace drew Miki, in spite of the unaccountable impulse that warned him to keep back. Wapoos, fascinated by his slow and deadly advance, made no movement, but sat as if frozen into stone. Then Miki was at him. His powerful jaws closed with a crunch. In the same instant there came the angry snap of steel, and a fisher trap closed on one of his hind feet. With a snarl he dropped Wapoos and turned upon it. Snap, snap, snap went 3 or more of Jacques's nest of traps. 2 of them missed. The third caught him by a front paw. As he had caught Wapoos, and as he had killed the fisher cat, so now he seized this new and savage enemy between his jaws. His fangs crunched on the cold steel. He literally tore it from his paw, so that blood streamed forth and stained the snow red. Madly he twisted himself to get at his hind foot. On this foot the fisher trap had secured a hold that was unbreakable. He ground it between his jaws until the blood ran from his mouth. He was fighting it when Le Beau came out from behind a clump of spruce 20 yards away with the killer at his heels. The brute stopped. He was panting and his eyes were aflame. 200 yards away he had heard the clinking of the trap chain. "Ow! He is there!" he gasped, tightening his hold on the killer's lead thong. "He is there, Netah, you Red Eye! That is the robber devil you are to kill almost. I will unfasten you, and then go to!" Miki, no longer fighting the trap, was eyeing them as they advanced. In this moment of peril he felt no fear of the man. In his veins the hot blood raged with a killing madness. The truth leaped upon him in a flash of instinctive awakening. These two were his enemies instead of the thing on his foot, the man beast and Netah the killer. He remembered as if it were yesterday. This was not the first time he had seen a man with a club in his hand. And Le Beau held a club. But he was not afraid. His steady eyes watched Netah. Unleashed by his master, the killer stood on stiff legs a dozen feet away, the wiry crest along his spine erect, his muscles tense. Miki heard the man beast's voice. "Go to, you devil! Go to!" Miki waited, without the quiver of a muscle. Thus much he had learned of his hard lessons in the wilderness, to wait, and watch, and use his cunning. He was flat on his belly, his nose between his forepaws. His lips were drawn back a little, just a little, but he made no sound, and his eyes were as steady as 2 points of flame. Le Beau stared. He felt suddenly a new thrill, and it was not the thrill of his desire for vengeance. Never had he seen a lynx or a fox or a wolf in a trap like that. Never had he seen a dog with eyes like the eyes that were on Netah. For a moment he held his breath. Foot by foot, and then almost inch by inch, the killer crept in. 10 feet, 8, 6. And all that time Miki made no move, never winked an eye. With a snarl like that of a tiger, Netah came at him. What happened then was the most marvellous thing that Jacques Le Beau had ever seen. So swiftly that his eyes could scarcely follow the movement, Miki had passed like a flash under the belly of Netah, and turning then at the end of his trap chain, he was at the killer's throat before Le Beau could have counted 10. They were down, and the brute gripped the club in his hand and stared like one fascinated. He heard the grinding crunch of jaws, and he knew they were the wild dog's jaws. He heard a snarl choking slowly into a wheezing sob of agony, and he knew that the sound came from the killer. The blood rose into his face. The red fire in his eyes grew livid, a blaze of exultation, of triumph. "Tonnerre de Dieu! He is choking the life out of Netah," he gasped. "Non, I have never seen a dog like that. I will keep him alive, and he shall fight Durant's Pouce over at Post Fort O' God. By the belly of Saint Gris, I say—" The killer was as good as dead if left another minute. With upraised club Le Beau advanced. As he sank his fangs deeper into Netah's throat, Miki saw the new danger out of the corner of his eye. He loosed his jaws and swung himself free of the killer as the club descended. He only partly evaded the smashing blow, which caught him on the shoulder and knocked him down. Quick as a flash he was on his feet and had lunged at Le Beau. The Frenchman was a master with the club. All his life he had used it, and he brought it around in a sudden side swing that landed with terrific force against Miki's head. The blood spurted from his mouth and nostrils. He was dazed and half blinded. He leaped again, and the club caught him once more. He heard Le Beau's ferocious cry of joy. A third, a fourth, and a fifth time he went down under the club, and Le Beau no longer laughed, but swung his weapon with a look that was half fear in his eyes. The sixth time the club missed, and Miki's jaws closed against the brute's chest, ripping away the thick coat and shirt as if they had been of paper, and leaving on Le Beau's skin a bleeding gash. 10 inches more, a little better vision in his blood-dimmed eyes, and he would have reached the man's throat. A great cry rose out of Le Beau. For an instant he felt the appalling nearness of death. "Netah! Netah!" he cried, and swung the club wildly. Netah did not respond. It may be that in this moment he sensed the fact that it was his master who had made him into a monster. About him was the wilderness, opening its doors of freedom. When Le Beau called again, the killer was slinking away, dripping blood as he went, and this was the last time that Le Beau saw of him. Probably he joined the wolves, for the killer was a quarter-strain wild. Le Beau got no more than a glimpse of him as he disappeared. His club arm shot out again, a clean miss, and this time it was pure chance that saved him. The trap chain caught, and Miki fell back when his hot breath was almost at the brute's jugular. He fell upon his side. Before he could recover himself, the club was pounding his head into the snow. The world grew black. He no longer had the power to move. Lying as if dead, he still heard over him the panting, exulting voice of the man-beast. For Le Beau, black though his heart was, could not keep back a prayerful cry of thankfulness that he was victor, and had missed death, though by a space no wider than the link of a chain. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. Nanette, the woman, saw Jacques come out of the edge of the timber late in the afternoon, dragging something on the snow behind him. In her heart, ever since her husband had begun to talk about him, she had kept secret to herself a pity for the wild dog. Long before the last baby had come, she had loved a dog. It was this dog that had given her the only real affection she had known in the company of the brute, and with barbarous cruelty Le Beau had driven it from her. Nanette herself had encouraged it to seek freedom in the wilderness, as Netah had at last sought his. Therefore she had prayed that the wild dog of the trapline might escape. As Le Beau came nearer, she saw that what he drew after him upon the snow was a sledge drag made of 4 lengths of sapling, and when, a moment later, she looked down at its burden, she gave a little cry of horror. Miki's 4 feet were tied so firmly to the pieces of sapling that he could not move. A cord about his neck was fastened to one of the crossbars, and over his jaws Le Beau had improvised a muzzle of unbreakable babiche thong. He had done all this before Miki regained consciousness after the clubbing. The woman stared, and there was a sudden catch in her breath, after the little cry that had fallen from her lips. Many times she had seen Jacques club his dogs, but never had she seen one clubbed like this. Micky's head and shoulders were a mass of frozen blood. And then she saw his eyes. They were looking straight up at her. She turned, fearing that Jacques might see what was in her face. Le Beau dragged his burden straight into the cabin, and then stood back and rubbed his hands as he looked at Miki on the floor. Nanette saw that he was in a strangely good humour, and waited. "By the blessed saints, but you should have seen him kill Netah, almost," he exulted. "Oui, he had him down by the throat quicker than you could flash your eye, and twice he was within an inch of my life when I fought him with a club. Dieu! I say, what will happen to Durant's dog when they meet at Post Fort O' God? I will make a side wager that he kills him before the second hand of Le Facteur's watch goes round twice. He is splendid. Watch him, Nanette, while I go make a corral for him alone. If I put him in with the pack he will kill them all." Miki's eyes followed him as he disappeared through the cabin door. Then he looked swiftly back to Nanette. She had drawn nearer. Her eyes were shining as she bent over him. A snarl rose in Miki's throat and died there. For the first time he was looking upon woman. He sensed, all at once, a difference as vast as the world itself. In his bruised and broken body his heart stood still. Nanette spoke to him. Never in his life had he heard a voice like hers, soft and gentle, with a breaking sob in it. And then, miracle of miracles, she had dropped on her knees and her hands were at his head. In that instant his spirit leaped back through the generations, back beyond his father and his father's father, back to that far day when the blood in the veins of his race was just dog, and he romped with children, and listened to the call of woman, and worshipped at the shrine of humankind. And now the woman had run quickly to the stove, and was back again with a dish of warm water and a soft cloth, and was bathing his head, talking to him all the time in that gentle, half-sobbing voice of pity and of love. He closed his eyes, no longer afraid. A great sigh heaved out of his body. He wanted to put out his tongue and lick the slim white hands that were bringing him peace and comfort. And then the strangest thing of all happened. In the crib the baby sat up and began to prattle. It was a new note to Miki, a new song of life's springtide to him, but it thrilled him as nothing else in all the world had ever thrilled him before. He opened his eyes wide and whined. A laugh of joy, new and strange even to herself, came into the woman's voice, and she ran to the crib and returned with the baby in her arms. She knelt down beside him again, and the baby, at sight of this strange plaything on the floor, thrust out its little arms, and kicked its tiny moccasined feet, and cooed and laughed, and squirmed until Miki strained at his thongs to get a little nearer that he might touch this wonderful creature with his nose. He forgot his pain. He no longer sensed the agony of his bruised and beaten jaws. He did not feel the numbness of his tightly bound and frozen legs. Every instinct in him was centred in these two. And the woman now was beautiful. She understood, and the gentle heart throbbed in her bosom, forgetful of the brute. Her eyes glowed with the soft radiance of stars. Into her pale cheeks came a sweet flush. She sat the baby down, and with the cloth and warm water continued to bathe Miki's head. Le Beau, had he been human, must have worshipped her then as she knelt there, all that was pure and beautiful in motherhood, an angel of mercy, radiant for a moment in her forgetfulness of HIM. And Le Beau did enter and see her, so quietly that for a space she did not realize his presence, and with him staring down on her she continued to talk and laugh and half sob, and the baby kicked and prattled and flung out its little arms wildly in the joy of these exciting moments. Le Beau's thick lips drew back in an ugly leer, and he gave a savage curse. Nanette flinched as if struck a blow. "Get up, you fool!" he snarled. She obeyed, shrinking back with the baby in her arms. Miki saw the change, and the greenish fire returned into his eyes when he caught sight of Le Beau. A deep and wolfish snarl rose in his throat. Le Beau turned on Nanette. The glow and the flush had not quite gone from her eyes and cheeks as she stood with the baby hugged up to her breast, and her big shining braid had fallen over her shoulder, glistening with a velvety fire in the light that came through the western window. But Le Beau saw nothing of this. "If you make a puss a house kitten of that dog, a thing like you made of Menu, the breed bitch, I will—" He did not finish, but his huge hands were clenched, and there was an ugly passion in his eyes. Nanette needed no more than that. She understood. She had received many blows, but there was the memory of one that never left her, night or day. Some day, if she could ever get to Post Fort O' God, and had the courage, she would tell Le Facteur of that blow, how Jacques Le Beau, her husband, struck it at the nursing time, and her bosom was so hurt that the baby of 2 years ago had died. She would tell it when she knew she and the baby would be safe from the vengeance of The Brute. And only Le Facteur, the big man at Post Fort O' God, 100 miles away, was powerful enough to save her. It was well that Le Beau did not read this thought in her mind now. With his warning he turned to Miki and dragged him out of the cabin to a cage made of saplings in which the winter before he had kept 2 live foxes. A small chain 10 feet in length he fastened around Miki's neck and then to one of the sapling bars, before he thrust his prisoner inside the door of the prison and freed him by cutting the babiche thongs with a knife. For several minutes after that Miki lay still while the blood made its way slowly through his numbed and half-frozen limbs. At last he staggered to his feet, and then it was that Le Beau chuckled jubilantly and turned back to the cabin. And now followed many days that were days of hell and torment for him, an unequal struggle between the power of The Brute and the spirit of the dog. "I must break you. Ah, by the Christ, I will break you," Le Beau would say time and again when he came with the club and the whip. "I will make you crawl to me. Oui. And when I say fight, you will fight." It was a small cage, so small that Miki could not get away from the reach of the club and the whip. They maddened him, for a time, and Le Beau's ugly soul was filled with joy as Miki launched himself again and again at the sapling bars, tearing at them with his teeth and frothing blood like a wolf gone mad. For 20 years Le Beau had trained fighting dogs, and this was his way. So he had done with Netah, until The Killer was mastered, and at his call crept to him on his belly. 3 times, from a window in the cabin, Nanette looked forth on these horrible struggles between the man and the dog, and the 3rd time she buried her face in her arms and sobbed. And when Le Beau came in and found her crying, he dragged her to the window and made her look out again at Miki, who lay bleeding and half dead in the cage. It was a morning on which he started the round of his traps, and he was always gone until late the following day, and never was he more than well out of sight than Nanette would run out and go to the cage. It was then that Miki forgot the brute. At times, so beaten and blinded that he could scarcely stand or see, he would crawl to the bars of the cage and caress the soft hands that Nanette held in fearlessly to him. And then, after a while, Nanette began to bring the baby out with her, bundled up like a little Eskimo, and in his joy Miki whimpered and wagged his tail, and grovelled in his worship before these two. It was in the second week of his captivity that the wonderful thing happened. Le Beau was gone, and there was a raging blizzard outside, to which Nanette dared not expose the baby. So she went to the cage, and with a heart that beat wildly she unbarred the door, and brought Miki into the cabin. If Le Beau should ever discover what she had done! The thought made her shiver. After this first time she brought him into the cabin again and again. Once her heart stood still when Le Beau saw blood on the floor, and his eyes shot at her suspiciously. Then she lied. "I cut my finger," she said, and a moment later, with her back to him, she did cut it, and when Jacques looked at her hand he saw a cloth about the finger, with blood stain on it. After that Nanette always watched the floor carefully. More and more this cabin, with the woman and the baby in it, became a paradise for Miki. Then came the time when Nanette dared to keep him in the cabin with her all night, and lying close to the precious cradle, Miki never once took his eyes from her. It was late when she prepared for bed. She changed into a long soft robe, and then, sitting near Miki, with her bare little feet in the fire glow, she took down her wonderful hair and began brushing it. It was the first time Miki had seen this new and marvellous garment about her. It fell over her shoulders and breast and almost to the floor in a shimmering glory, and the scent of it was so sweet that Miki crept a few inches nearer and whimpered softly. After she had done brushing it, Miki watched her as her slim fingers plaited it into 2 braids, and then, before she put the light out, a still more curious thing happened. She went to her bed, made of saplings, against the wall, and from its hiding place under the blankets drew forth tenderly a little ivory crucifix. With this in her hands she knelt upon the log floor, and Miki listened to her prayer. He did not know, but she was asking God to be good to her baby, the little Nanette in the crib. After that she cuddled the baby up in her arms, and put out the light and went to bed. And through all the hours of the night Miki made no sound that would waken them. In the morning, when Nanette opened her eyes, she found Miki with his head resting on the edge of the bed, close to the baby that was nestled against her bosom. That morning, as she built the fire, something strange and stirring in Nanette's breast made her sing. Le Beau would be away until dark that night, and she would never dare to tell him what she and the baby and the dog were going to do. It was her birthday, 26, and it seemed to her that she had lived the time of 2 lives. And 8 of those years with The Brute. But today they would celebrate, they 3. All the morning the cabin was filled with a new spirit, a new happiness. Years ago, before she had met Le Beau, the Indians away back on the Waterfound had called Nanette Tante Pennache, the little bird, because of the marvellous sweetness of her voice. And this morning she sang as she prepared the birthday feast. The sun flooded through the windows, and Miki whimpered happily and thumped his tail, and the baby cackled and crowed, and the Brute was forgotten. In that forgetfulness Nanette was a girl again, sweet and beautiful as in those days when old Jackpine, the Cree, who was now dead, had told her that she was born of the flowers. The wonderful dinner was ready at last, and to the baby's delight, Nanette induced Miki to sit on a chair at the table. He felt foolish there, and he looked so foolish that Nanette laughed until her long dark lashes were damp with tears. And then, when Miki slunk down from the chair, feeling his shame horribly, she ran to him and put her arms around him and pleaded with him until he took his place at the table again. So the day passed until mid-afternoon, when Nanette cleared away all signs of the celebration and locked Miki in his cage. It was fortunate she was ahead of time, for scarcely was she done when Le Beau came into the edge of the clearing, and with him was Durant, his acquaintance and rival from the edge of the barrens farther north. Durant had sent his outfit on to Port O' God by an Indian, and had struck south and west with 2 dogs and a sledge to visit a cousin for a day or two. He was on his way to the post when he came upon Le Beau on his trapline. Thus much Le Beau told Nanette, and Nanette looked at Durant with startled eyes. They were a good pair, Jacques and his guest, only that Durant was older. She had become somewhat accustomed to the brutality in Le Beau's face, but she thought that Durant was a monster. He made her afraid, and she was glad when they went from the cabin. "Now I will show you the bête that is going to kill your puss as easily as your lead whelp killed that rabbit today, monsieur," exulted Jacques. "I have told you, but you have not seen." And he took with him the club and the whip. Like a tiger fresh out of the jungles, Miki responded to the club and the whip today, until Durant himself stood aghast, and exclaimed under his breath, "Mon Dieu, he is a devil!" From the window Nanette saw what was happening, and out of her rose a cry of anguish. Sudden as a burst of fire there arose in her, triumphant at last and unafraid, that thing which for years the Brute had crushed back, her womanhood resurrected, her soul broken free of its shackles, her faith, her strength, her courage. She turned from the window and ran to the door, and out over the snow to the cage, and for the first time in her life she struck at Le Beau and beat fiercely at the arm that was wielding the club. "You beast!" she cried. "I tell you, you shall not! Do you hear? You shall not!" Paralyzed with amazement, the Brute stood still. Was this Nanette, his slave? This wonderful creature with eyes that were glowing fire and defiance, and a look in her face that he had never seen in any woman's face before? No, impossible! Hot rage rose in him, and with a single sweep of his powerful arm he flung her back so that she fell to the earth. With a wild curse he lifted the bar of the cage door. "I will kill him now! I will kill him!" he almost shrieked. "And it is you she devil, who shall eat his heart alive. I will force it down your throat. I will—" He was dragging Miki forth by the chain. The club rose as Miki's head came through. In another instant it would have beaten his head to a pulp, but Nanette was between it and the dog like a flash, and the blow went wild. It was with his fist that Le Beau struck out now, and the blow caught Nanette on the shoulder and sent her frail body down with a crash. The Brute sprang upon her. His fingers gripped in her thick, soft hair. And then, from Durant came a warning cry. It was too late. A lean, grey streak of vengeance and retribution Miki was at the end of his chain and at Le Beau's throat. Nanette heard. Through dazed eyes she saw. She reached out gropingly and struggled to her feet, and looked just once down upon the snow. Then with a terrible cry she staggered toward the cabin. When Durant gathered courage to drag Le Beau out of Miki's reach, Miki made no movement to harm him. Again, perhaps, it was the beneficent spirit that told him his duty was done. He went back into his cage, and lying there in his belly looked forth at Durant. And Durant, looking at the blood-stained snow and the dead body of the brute, whispered to himself again, "Mon Dieu, he is a devil!" In the cabin Nanette was upon her knees before the crucifix. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. There are times when death is a shock, but not a grief, and so it was with Nanette Le Beau. With her own eyes she had looked upon the terrible fate of her husband, and it was not in her gentle soul to weep or wish him alive again. At last there had overtaken him what le bon Dieu had intended him to receive some day: justice. And for the baby's sake more than her own, Nanette was not sorry. Durant, whose soul was only a little less wicked than the dead man's, had not even waited for a prayer, had not asked her what to do. He had chopped a hole in the frozen earth, and had buried Le Beau almost before his body was cold. And Nanette was not sorry for that. The brute was gone. He was gone forever. He would never strike her again. And because of the baby she offered up a prayer of gratitude to God. In his prison cage of sapling bars Miki cringed on his belly at the end of his chain. He had scarcely moved since those terrible moments in which he had torn the life out of the man brute's throat. He had not even growled at Durant when he dragged the body away. Upon him had fallen a fearful and overwhelming oppression. He was not thinking of his own brutal beatings, or of the death which Le Beau had been about to inflict upon him with the club. He did not feel the presence of pain in his bruised and battered body, nor in his bleeding jaws and whip-lashed eyes. He was thinking of Nanette, the woman. Why had she run away with that terrible cry when he killed the man beast? Was it not the man beast who had struck her down, and whose hands were at her white throat when he sprang the length of his chain and tore out his jugular? Then why was it that she ran away and did not come back? He whimpered softly. The afternoon was almost gone, and the early gloom of midwinter night in the Northland was settling quickly over the forests. In that gloom the dark face of Durant appeared at the bars of Miki's prison. Instinctively Miki had hated this fox hunter from the edge of the barrens, just as he had hated Le Beau, for in their brutish faces as well as in their hearts they were like brothers. Yet he did not growl at Durant as he peered through. He did not even move. "Ugh, le diable!" shuddered Durant. Then he laughed. It was a low, terrible laugh, half smothered in his coarse black beard, and it sent an odd chill through Miki. He turned after that and went into the cabin. Nanette rose to meet him, her great dark eyes glowing in a face dead white. She had not yet risen above the shock of Le Beau's tragic death, and yet in those eyes there was already something reborn. It had not been there when Durant came to the cabin with Le Beau that afternoon. He looked at her strangely as she stood with the baby in her arms. She was another Nanette. He felt uneasy. Why was it that a few hours ago he had laughed boldly when her husband had cursed her and said vile things in her presence, and now he could not meet the steady gaze of her eyes? Dieu! He had never before observed how lovely she was. He drew himself together, and stated the business in his mind. "You will not want the dog," he said. "I will take him away." Nanette did not answer. She seemed scarcely to be breathing as she looked at him. It seemed to him that she was waiting for him to explain, and then the inspiration to lie leaped into his mind. "You know there was to be the big fight between his dog and mine at Poste Fort O' God at the New Year carnival," he went on, shuffling his heavy feet. "For that Jacques, your husband, was training the wild dog. And when I saw that Uchon, that wolf devil, tearing at the bars of the cage, I knew he would kill my dog as a fox kills a rabbit. So we struck a bargain, and for the 2 cross foxes and the 10 red which I have outside I bought him. The vraisemblance of his lie gave him courage. It sounded like truth, and Jacques, the dead man, was not there to repudiate his claim. So he is mine," he finished a little exultantly, "and I will take him to the post, and will fight him against any dog or wolf in all the North. Shall I bring in the skins, madame?" "He is not for sale," said Nanette, the glow in her eyes deepening. "He is my dog, mine and the baby's. Do you understand, Henri Durant? He is not for sale." "Oui," gasped Durant, amazed. "And when you reach Poste Fort O' God, monsieur, you will tell le facteur that Jacques is dead, and how he died, and say that someone must be sent for the baby and me. We will stay here until then." "Oui," said Durant again, backing to the door. He had never seen her like that. He wondered how Jacques Le Beau could swear at her, and strike her. For himself, he was afraid. Standing there with those wonderful eyes and white face, with the baby in her arms, and her shining hair over her breasts, she made him think of a picture he had once seen of the Blessed Lady. He went out through the door and back to the sapling cage where Miki lay. Softly he spoke through the bars. "Oh, Bete," he called, "she will not sell you. She keeps you because you fought for her, and killed mon ami, Jacques Le Beau. And so I must take you my own way. In a little while the moon will be up, and then I will slip a noose over your head at the end of a pole, and will choke you so quickly she will not hear a sound. And who will know where you are gone, if the cage door is left open? And you will fight for me at Poste Fort O' God. Mon Dieu, how you will fight! I swear it will do the ghost of Jacques Le Beau good to see what happens there." He went away, to where he had left his light sledge and 2 dogs in the edge of the timber, and waited for the moon to rise. Still Miki did not move. A light had appeared in the window of the cabin, and his eyes were fixed on it yearningly as the low whine gathered in his throat again. His world no longer lay beyond that window. The woman and the baby had obliterated in him all desire but to be with them. In the cabin Nanette was thinking of him and of Durant. The man's words came to her again, vividly, significantly. "You will not want the dog." Yes, all the forest people would say that same thing, even le facteur himself, when he heard. She would not want the dog. And why not? Because he had killed Jacques Le Beau, her husband, in defence of her? Because he had freed her from the bondage of The Brute? Because God had sent him to the end of his chain in that terrible moment that the baby Nanette might live, as the other had not, and that she might grow up with laughter on her lips instead of sobs? In her there rose suddenly a thought that fanned the new flame in her heart. It must have been le bon Dieu. Others might doubt, but she, never. She recalled all that Le Beau had told her about the wild dog, how for many days he had robbed the traps, and the terrific fight he had made when at last he was caught. And of all that the brute had said there stood out most the words he had spoken one day. "He is a devil, but he was not born of wolf. No, some time, a long time ago, he was a white man's dog." A white man's dog! Her soul thrilled. Once, a long time ago, he had known a master with a white heart, just as she had known a girlhood in which the flowers bloomed and the birds sang. She tried to look back, but she could not see very far. She could not vision that day, less than a year ago, when Miki, an angular pup, came down out of the farther north with Challoner. She could not vision the strange comradeship between the pup and Neewa, the little black bear cub, nor that tragic day when they had fallen out of Challoner's canoe into the swift stream that had carried them over the waterfall and into the great adventure which had turned Neewa into a grown bear and Miki into a wild dog. But in her heart she felt the things which she could not see. Miki had not come by chance. Something greater than that had sent him. She rose quietly, so that she would not waken the baby in the crib, and opened the door. The moon was just rising over the forest and through the glow of it she went to the cage. She heard the dog's joyous whine, and then she felt the warm caress of his tongue upon her bare hands as she thrust them between the sapling bars. "No, no, you are not a devil," she cried softly, her voice filled with a strange tremble. "Oo ee, my Sohikatao! I prayed, prayed, and you came. Yes, on my knees each night I prayed to our Blessed Lady that she might have mercy on my baby, and make the sun in heaven shine for her through all time. And you came! And the dear God does not send devils in answer to prayer. No, never." And Miki, as though some spirit had given him the power to understand, rested the weight of his bruised and beaten head on her hands. From the edge of the forest Durant was watching. He had caught the flash of light from the door and had seen Nanette go to the cage, and his eyes did not leave her until she returned into the cabin. He laughed as he went to his fire and finished making the wagon he was fastening to the end of a long pole. This wagon and the pole added to his own cleverness were saving him 12 good fox skins, and he continued to chuckle there in the fire glow as he thought how easy it was to beat a woman's wits. Nanette was a fool to refuse the pelts, and Jacques was dead. It was a most lucky combination of circumstances for him. Fortune had surely come his way. On Le Bête, as he called the wild dog, he would gamble all that he possessed in the big fight, and he would win. He waited until the light in the cabin went out before he approached the cage again. Miki heard him coming. At a considerable distance he saw him, for the moon was already turning the night into day. Durant knew the ways of dogs. With them he employed a superior reason, where Le Beau had used the club and the rawhide. So he came up openly and boldly, and, as if by accident, dropped the end of the pole between the bars. With his hands against the cage, apparently unafraid, he began talking in a casual way. He was different from Le Beau. Miki watched him closely for a space, and then let his eyes rest again on the darkened cabin window. Stealthily Durant began to take advantage of his opportunity. A little at a time he moved the end of the pole until it was over Mickey's head, with the deadly bowstring and its open noose hanging down. He was an adept in the use of the WAGON. Many foxes and wolves, and even a bear, he had caught that way. Mickey, numbed by the cold, scarcely felt the babiche noose as it settled softly about his neck. He did not see Durant brace himself, with his feet against the running log of the cage. Then, suddenly, Durant lurched himself backward, and it seemed to Mickey as though a giant trap of steel had closed about his neck. Instantly his wind was cut off. He could make no sound as he struggled frantically to free himself. Hand over hand, Durant dragged him to the bars, and there, with his feet still braced, he choked with his whole weight until, when at last he let up on the WAGON, Mickey collapsed as if dead. 10 seconds later, Durant was looping a muzzle over his closed jaws. He left the cage door open when he went back to his sledge, carrying Mickey in his arms. Nanette's slow wits would never guess, he told himself. She would think that Le Bete had escaped into the forest. It was not his scheme to club Mickey into serfdom, as Le Beau had failed to do. Durant was wiser than that. In his crude and merciless way he had come to know certain phenomena of the animal mind. He was not a psychologist. On the other hand, brutality had not utterly blinded him. So, instead of lashing Mickey to the sledge as Le Beau had fastened him to his improvised drag, Durant made his captive comfortable, covering him with a warm blanket before he began his journey eastward. He made sure, however, that there was no flaw in the muzzle about Mickey's jaws, and that the free end of the chain to which he was still fastened was well hitched to the G-bar of his sledge. When these things were done, Durant set off in the direction of Fort O' God, and if Jacques Le Beau could have seen him then, he would have had good reason to guess at his elation. By taint of birth and blood, Durant was a gambler first and a trapper afterward. He set his traps that he might have the thrill of wagering his profits, and for half a dozen successive years he had won at the big annual dog fight at Post Fort O' God. But this year he had been half afraid. His fear had not been of Jacques Le Beau and Netah, but of the half-breed away over on Red Belly Lake. Grouse Piet was the half-breed's name, and the dog that he was going to put up at the fight was half wolf. Therefore, in the foolish eagerness of his desire, had Durant offered 2 cross foxes and 10 reds, the price of 5 dogs and not 1, for the possession of Le Beau's wild dog. And now that he had him for nothing, and Nanette was poorer by 12 skins, he was happy. For he had now a good match for Grouse Piet's half-wolf, and he would chance his money and his credit at the post to the limit. When Mickey came back to his senses, Durant stopped his dogs, for he had been watching closely for this moment. He bent over the sledge and began talking, not in Le Beau's brutal way, but in a careless, chummy sort of voice, and with his mittened hand he patted his captive's head. This was a new thing to Mickey, for he knew that it was not the hand of Nanette, but of a man-beast, and the softness of his nest in the blanket, over which Henri had thrown a bearskin, was also new. A short time ago he was frozen and stiff. Now he was warm and comfortable. So he did not move. And Durant exulted in his cleverness. He did not travel far in the night, but stopped 4 or 5 miles from Nanette's cabin and built a fire. Over this he boiled coffee and roasted meat. He allowed the meat to roast slowly, turning it round and round on a wooden spit, so that the aroma of it grew thick and inviting in the air. He had fastened his 2 sledge dogs 50 paces away, but the sledge was close to the fire, and he watched the effect on Miki of the roasting meat. Since the days of his puppyhood with Challoner, a smell like that which came from the meat had not filled Miki's nostrils, and at last Durant saw him lick his chops and heard the click of his teeth. He chuckled in his beard. Still he waited another quarter of an hour. Then he pulled the meat off the spit, cut it up, and gave a half of it to Miki. And Miki ate it ravenously. A clever man was Henri Durant. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. During the last few days in December, all trails for 10,000 miles around led to Post Fort O' God. It was the eve of Uskapipun, of the New Year, the midwinter carnival time of the people of the wilderness, when from teepees and cabins far and near come the trappers and their families to sell their furs and celebrate for a few days with others of their kind. To this New Year gathering men, women, and children look forward through long and weary months. The trapper's wife has no neighbor. Her husband's line is a little kingdom inviolate, with no other human life within many miles of it. So for the women the Uskapipun is a time of rejoicing, for the children it is the big circus, and for the men a reward for the labor and hardship of catching their fur. During these few days old acquaintanceships are renewed and new ones are made. It is here that the news of the trackless wilderness is spread, the news of deaths, of marriages, and of births, of tragic happenings that bring horror and grief and tears, and of others that bring laughter and joy. For the first and last time in all the 7 months' winter the people of the forests come to town. Indian, half-breed, blood, and white man join in the holiday without distinction of color or creed. This year there was to be a great caribou roast, a huge barbecue at Fort O' God, and by the time Henri Durant came within half a dozen miles of the post, the trails from north and south and east and west were beaten hard by the tracks of dogs and men. That year 100 sledges came in from the forests, and with them were 300 men and women and children and half 1,000 dogs. Durant was a day later than he had planned to be, but he had made good use of his time. For Miki, while still muzzled, now followed at the end of the babiche that was tied to Henri's sledge. In the afternoon of the 3rd day after leaving Nanette Le Beau's cabin, Durant turned off the main traveled trail until he came to the shack of André Ribon, who kept the factor and his people at the post supplied with fresh meat. André, who was becoming over-anxious at Durant's delay, was still waiting when his friend came. It was here that Henri's Indian had left his fighting dog, the big husky. And here he left Miki, locked in André's shack. Then the 2 men went on to the post, which was only a mile away. Neither he nor Ribon returned that night. The cabin was empty. And with the beginning of dusk Miki began to hear weird and strange sounds, which grew louder as darkness settled deeper. It was the sound of the carnival at the post, the distant tumult of human voice mingled with the howling of 100 dogs. He had never heard anything like it before, and for a long time he listened without moving. Then he stood up like a man before the window with his forepaws resting against the heavy sash. Ribon's cabin was at the crest of a knoll that overlooked the frozen lake, and far off, over the tops of the scrub timber, that fringed the edge of it, Miki saw the red glow in the sky made by a score of great camp fires. He whined, and dropped on his 4 feet again. It was a long wait between that and another day. But the cabin was more comfortable than Le Beau's prison cage had been. All through the night his restless slumber was filled with visions of Nanette and the baby. Durant and Ribon did not return until nearly noon the next day. They brought with them fresh meat, of which Miki ate ravenously, for he was hungry. In an unresponsive way he tolerated the advances of these two. A second night he was left alone in the cabin. When Durant and Ribon came back again in the early dawn, they brought with them a cage 4 feet square made of small birch saplings. The open door of this cage they drew close to the door of the cabin, and by means of a chunk of fresh meat Miki was induced to enter through it. Instantly the trap fell, and he was a prisoner. The cage was already fastened on a wide toboggan, and scarcely was the sun up when Miki was on his way to Fort O' God. This was the big day at the carnival, the day of the caribou roast and the fight. For many minutes before they came in sight of Fort O' God, Miki heard the growling sound. It amazed him, and he stood up on his feet in his cage, rigid and alert, utterly unconscious of the men who were pulling him. He was looking ahead of them, and Durant chuckled exultantly as they heard him growl and his teeth click. "Oui, he will fight. He would fight now," he chuckled. They were following the shore of a lake. Suddenly they came around the end of a point, and all of Fort O' God lay on the rising shelf of the shore ahead of them. The growl died in Miki's throat. His teeth shut with a last click. For an instant his heart seemed to grow dead and still. Until this moment his world had held only half a dozen human beings. Now, so suddenly that he had no flash of warning, he saw 100 of them, 200, 300. At sight of Durant and the cage, a swarm of them began running down to the shore. And everywhere there were wolves, so many of them that his senses grew dazed as he stared. His cage was the center of a clamoring, gesticulating horde of men and boys as it was dragged up the slope. Women began joining the crowd, many of them with small children in their arms. Then his journey came to an end. He was close to another cage, and in that cage was a beast like himself. Beside this cage there stood a tall, swarthy, shaggy-headed half-breed who looked like a pirate. The man was Grouse Piet, Durant's rival. A contemptuous leer was on his thick-lipped face as he looked at Miki. He turned, and to the group of dark-faced Indians and breeds about him he said something that roused a guttural laugh. Durant's face flamed red. "Laugh, you heathen," he challenged. "But don't forget that Henri Durant is here to take your bets." Then he shook the 2 cross and 10 of red foxes in the face of Grouse Piet. "Cover them, Grouse Piet," he cried, "and I have 10 times more where they came from." With his muzzle lifted, Miki was sniffing the air. It was filled with strange scents, heavy with the odors of men, of dogs, and of the 5 huge caribou roasting on their spits 15 feet over the big fires that were built under them. For 10 hours those caribou would roast, turning slowly on spits as thick as a man's leg. The fight was to come before the feast. For an hour the clatter and tumult of voices hovered about the 2 cages. Men appraised the fighters and made their bets, and Grouse Piet and Henri Durant made their throats hoarse, flinging banter and contempt at each other. At the end of the hour the crowd began to thin out. In the place of men and women half a hundred dark-visaged little children crowded about the cages. It was not until then that Miki caught glimpses of the hordes of beasts fastened in ones and twos and groups in the edge of the clearing. His nostrils had at last caught the distinction. They were not wolves. They were like himself. It was a long time before his eyes rested steadily on the wolf dog in the other cage. He went to the edge of his bars and sniffed. The wolf dog thrust his gaunt muzzle toward him. He made Miki think of the huge wolf he had fought one day on the edge of the cliff, and instinctively he showed his fangs and snarled. The wolf dog snarled back. Henri Durant rubbed his hands exultantly, and Grouse Piet laughed softly. "Oui, they will fight," said Henri again. "The wolf he will fight, oui," said Grouse Piet. "But your dog, monsieur, he will be very sick like a puppy when the fight come." A little later Miki saw a white man standing close to his cage. It was MacDonnell, the Scotch factor. He gazed at Miki and the wolf dog with troubled eyes. 10 minutes later, in the little room which he had made his office, he was saying to a younger man: "I'd like to stop it, but I can't. They wouldn't stand for it. It would lose us half a season's catch of fur. There's been a fight like this at Fort O' God for the last 50 years, and I don't suppose, after all, that it's any worse than one of the prize fights down there. Only, in this case—" "They kill," said the younger man. "Yes, that's it. Usually one of the dog dies." The younger man knocked the ash out of his pipe. "I love dogs," he said simply. "There'll never be a fight at my post, Mac, unless it's between men. And I'm not going to see this fight, because I'm afraid I'd kill someone if I did." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The caribou were roasting brown. In 2 more hours the feast would begin. The hour of the fight was at hand. In the center of the clearing 300 men, women, and children were gathered in a close circle about a sapling cage 10 feet square. Close to this cage, one at each side, were drawn the 2 smaller cages. Beside one of these cages stood Henri Durant. Beside the other, Grouse Piet. They were not bantering now. Their faces were hard and set. And 300 pair of eyes were staring at them, and 300 pairs of ears waiting for the thrilling signal. It came from Grouse Piet. With a swift movement, Durant pulled up the door of Miki's cage. Then, suddenly, he prodded him from behind with a crotch stick, and with a single leap Miki was in the big cage. Almost at the same instant the wolf dog leapt from Grouse Piet's cage, and the two faced each other in the arena. With the next breath he drew Durant could have groaned. What happened in the following half minute was a matter of environment with Miki. In the forest the wolf dog would have interested him to the exclusion of everything else, and he would have looked upon him as another Netah or a wild wolf. But in his present surroundings the idea of fighting was the last to possess him. He was fascinated by that grim and waiting circle of faces closing in the big cage. He scrutinized it, turning his head sharply from point to point, as if hoping to see Nanette and the baby, or even Challoner, his first master. To the wolf dog Grouse Piet had given the name of Taao, because of the extraordinary length of his fangs. And of Taao, to Durant's growing horror, Miki was utterly oblivious after that first head-on glance. He trotted to the edge of the cage and thrust his nose between the bars, and a taunting laugh rose out of Grouse Piet's throat. Then he began making a circle of the cage, his sharp eyes on the silent ring of faces. Tao stood in the centre of the cage, and not once did his reddish eyes leave Miki. What was outside of the cage held small interest for him. He understood his business, and murder was bred in his heart. For a space during which Durant's heart beat like a hammer, Tao turned, as if on a pivot, following Miki's movement, and the crest on his spine stood up like bristles. Then Miki stopped, and in that moment Durant saw the end of all his hopes. Without a sound the wolf dog was at his opponent. A bellow rose from Grouse Piet's lips. A deep breath passed through the circle of spectators, and Durant felt a cold chill run up his back to the roots of his hair. What happened in the next instant made men's hearts stand still. In that first rush Miki should have died. Grouse Piet expected him to die, and Durant expected him to die. But in the last fractional bit of the second in which the wolf dog's jaws closed, Miki was transformed into a thing of living lightning. No man had ever seen a movement swifter than that with which he turned on Tao. Their jaws clashed. There was a sickening grinding of bone, and in another moment they were rolling and twisting together on the earth floor. Neither Grouse Piet nor Durant could see what was happening. They forgot even their own bets in the horror of that fight. Never had there been such a fight at Fort O' God. The sound of it reached to the company's store. In the door, looking toward the big cage, stood the young white man. He heard the snarling, the clashing of teeth, and his jaws set heavily, and a dull flame burned in his eyes. His breath came in a sudden gasp. "Damn!" he cried softly. His hands clenched, and he stepped slowly down from the door and went toward the cage. It was over when he made his way through the ring of spectators. The fight had ended as suddenly as it had begun, and Grouse Piet's wolf dog lay in the centre of the cage with a severed jugular. Miki looked as though he might be dying. Durant had opened the door and had slipped a rope over his head, and outside the cage Miki stood swaying on his feet, red with blood and half blind. His flesh was red and bleeding in a dozen places, and a stream of blood trickled from his mouth. A cry of horror rose to the young white man's lips as he looked down at him. And then, almost in the same breath, there came a still stranger cry. "Good God! Miki! Miki! Miki!" Beating upon his brain as if from a vast distance, coming to him through the blindness of his wounds, Miki heard that voice. The voice that had lived with him in all his dreams, the voice he had waited for, and searched for, and knew that some day he would find. The voice of Challoner, his master. He dropped on his belly, whining, trying to see through the film of blood in his eyes, and lying there, wounded almost unto death, his tail thumped the ground in recognition. And then, to the amazement of all who beheld, Challoner was down upon his knees beside him, and his arms were about him, and Miki's lacerated tongue was reaching for his hands, his face, his clothes. "Miki! Miki! Miki!" Durant's hand fell heavily upon Challoner's shoulder. It was like the touch of a red-hot iron to Challoner. In a flash he was on his feet, facing him. "He's mine!" Challoner cried, trying to hold back his passion. "He's mine, you devil!" And then, powerless to hold back his desire for vengeance, his clenched fist swung like a rock to Durant's heavy jaw, and the Frenchman went to the ground. For a moment Challoner stood over him, but he did not move. Fiercely he turned upon Grouse Piet and the crowd. Miki was cringing at his feet again. Pointing to him, Challoner cried loudly so all could hear. "He's my dog. Where this beast got him I don't know, but he's mine. Look for yourselves. See him lick my hand? Would he do that for HIM? And look at that ear. There's no other ear in all the North cut like that. I lost him almost a year ago, but I'd know him among 10,000 by that ear. By God, if I had known—" He elbowed his way through the breeds and Indians, leading Miki by the rope Durant had slipped over the dog's head. He went to MacDonnell and told him what had happened. He told of the preceding spring, and of the accident in which Miki and the bear cub were lost from his canoe and swept over the waterfall. After registering his claim against whatever Durant might have to say, he went to the shack in which he was staying at Fort O' God. An hour later Challoner sat with Miki's big head between his two hands and talked to him. He had bathed and dressed his wounds, and Miki could see. His eyes were on his master's face, and his hard tail thumped the floor. Both were oblivious to the sounds of the revellers outside, the cries of men, the shouting of boys, the laughter of women, and the incessant barking of dogs. In Challoner's eyes there was a soft glow. "Miki, old boy, you haven't forgotten a thing, not a damn thing, have you? You were nothing but an ornery-legged pup then, but you didn't forget. Remember what I told you when I was going to take you and the cub down to the girl? Do you remember? The girl I said was an angel, and 'd love you to death, and all that? Well, I'm glad something happened, and you didn't go. It wasn't the same when I got back, and she wasn't the same, Miki. Lord, she'd got married, and had 2 kids. Think of that, old scout, 2! How the deuce could she have taken care of you and the cub, eh? And nothing else was the same, boy. 3 years in God's country, up here where you burst your lungs just for the fun of drinking in air, changed me a lot, I guess. Inside a week I wanted to come back, Miki. Yes, sir, I was sick to come back. So I came. And we're going to stick now, Miki. You're going with me up to that new post the company has given me. From now on we're pals. Understand, old scout? We're pals." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. It was late the night of the big feast at Post Fort O' God that MacDonnell, the factor, sent for Challoner. Challoner was preparing for bed when an Indian boy pounded on the door of his shack, and a moment later gave him the message. He looked at his watch. It was 11 o'clock. What could the factor want of him at that hour, he wondered. Flat on his belly near the warm box stove, Miki watched his new-found master speculatively as he pulled on his boots. His eyes were wide open now. Challoner had washed from him the blood of the terrific fight of that afternoon. "Something to do with that devil of a Durant," growled Challoner, looking at the battle-scarred dog. "Well, if he hopes to get you again, Miki, he's barking up the wrong tree. You're mine." Miki thumped his tail hard on the floor and wriggled toward his master in mute adoration. Together they went out into the night. It was a night of white moonlight and a multitude of stars. The 4 great fires over which the caribou had roasted for the savage barbecue that day were still burning brightly. In the edge of the forest that ringed in the post were the smoldering embers of a score of smaller fires. Back of these fires were faintly outlined the gray shadows of teepees and tents. In these shelters the 300 half-breeds and Indians who had come in from the forest trails to the New Year carnival at the post were sleeping. Only here and there was there a movement of life. Even the dogs were quiet after the earlier hours of excitement and gluttony. Past the big fires, with their huge spits still standing, Challoner passed towards the factor's quarters. Miki sniffed at the freshly picked bones. Beyond these bones there was no sign of the 2,000 pounds of flesh that had roasted that day on the spits. Men, women, children, and dogs had stuffed themselves until there was nothing left. It was the silence of Mutai, the belly god, the god who eats himself to sleep each night, that hovered strangely over this post of Fort o' God, 300 miles from civilization. There was a light in the factor's room, and Challoner entered with Miki at his heels. MacDonnell, the Scotchman, was puffing moodily on his pipe. There was a worried look in his ruddy face as the younger man seated himself, and his eyes were on Miki. "Durant has been here," he said. "He's ugly. I'm afraid of trouble. If you hadn't struck him—" Challoner shrugged his shoulders as he filled his own pipe from the factor's tobacco. "You see, you don't just understand the situation at Fort o' God," went on MacDonnell. "There's been a big dog fight here at New Year for the last 50 years. It's become a part of history, a part of Fort o' God itself, and that's why in my own 15 years here I haven't tried to stop it. I believe it would bring on a sort of revolution. I'd wager a half of my people would go to another post with their furs. That's why all the sympathy seems to be with Durant. Even Grouse Piet, his rival, tells him he's a fool to let you get away with him that way. Durant says that dog is his." MacDonnell nodded at Miki, lying at Challoner's feet. "Then he lies," said Challoner quietly. "He says he bought him of Jacques Le Beau." "Then Le Beau sold a dog that didn't belong to him." For a moment MacDonnell was silent. Then he said: "But that wasn't what I had you come over for, Challoner. Durant told me something that froze my blood to night. Your outfit starts for your post up in the Reindeer Lake country to morrow, doesn't it?" "In the morning." "Then could you, with one of my Indians and a team, arrange to swing around by way of the Jackson's Knee? You'd lose a week, but you could overtake your outfit before it reached the Reindeer, and it would be a mighty big favor to me. There's a hell of a thing happened over there." Again he looked at Miki. "God!" he breathed. Challoner waited. He thought he saw a shudder pass through the factor's shoulders. "I'd go myself. I ought to, but this frosted lung of mine has made me sit tight this winter, Challoner. I ought to go. Why," a sudden glow shot into his eyes, "I knew this Nanette Le Beau when she was so high, 15 years ago. I watched her grow up, Challoner. If I hadn't been married, then I'd have fallen in love with her. Do you know her, Challoner? Did you ever see Nanette Le Beau?" Challoner shook his head. "An angel, if God ever made one," declared MacDonnell through his red beard. "She lived over beyond the Jackson's Knee with her father, and he died, froze to death crossing Red Eye Lake one night. I've always thought Jacques Le Beau made her marry him after that. Or else she didn't know, or was crazed or frightened at being alone. Anyway, she married him. It was 5 years ago I saw her last. Now and then I've heard things, but I didn't believe, not all of them. I didn't believe that Le Beau beat her and knocked her down when he wanted to. I didn't believe he dragged her through the snow by her hair one day until she was nearly dead. They were just rumors, and he was 70 miles away. But I believe them now. Durant came from their place, and I guess he told me a whole lot of the truth, to save that dog." Again he looked at Miki. "You see, Durant tells me that Le Beau caught the dog in one of his traps, took him to his cabin, and tortured him into shape for the big fight. When Durant came, he was so taken with the dog that he bought him, and it was while Le Beau was driving the dog mad in his cage to show his temper that Nanette interfered. Le Beau knocked her down, and then jumped on her, and was pulling her hair and choking her, when the dog went for him and killed him. That's the story. Durant told me the truth through fear that I'd have the dog shot if he was an out-and-out murderer. And that's why I want you to go by way of the Jackson's Knee. I want you to investigate, and I want you to do what you can for Nanette Le Beau. My Indian will bring her back to Fort O' God." With Scotch stoicism, MacDonnell had repressed whatever excitement he may have felt. He spoke quietly. But the curious shudder went through his shoulders again. Challoner stared at him in blank amazement. "You mean to say that Miki, this dog, has killed a man?" "Yes, he killed him, Durant says, just as he killed Grouse Piet's wolf dog in the big fight today. Ugh!" As Challoner's eyes fell slowly upon Miki, the factor added, "But Grouse Piet's dog was better than the man. If what I hear about Le Beau was true, he's better dead than alive. Challoner, if you didn't think it too much trouble, and could go that way, and see Nanette—" "I'll go," said Challoner, dropping a hand to Miki's head. For half an hour after that, MacDonnell told him the things he knew about Nanette Le Beau. When Challoner rose to go, the factor followed him to the door. "Keep your eyes open for Durant," he warned. "That dog is worth more to him than all his winnings to day, and they say his stakes were big. He won heavily from Grouse Piet, but the half breed is thick with him now. I know it. So watch out." Out in the open space, in the light of the moon and stars, Challoner stood for a moment with Miki's forepaws resting against his breast. The dog's head was almost on a level with his shoulders. "Do you remember when you fell out of the canoe, boy?" he asked softly. "Remember how you and the cub were tied in the bow, and you got to scrapping and fell overboard just above the rapids? Remember? By Jove, those rapids pretty near got me, too. I thought you were dead, sure, both of you. I wonder what happened to the cub?" Miki whined in response, and his whole body trembled. "And since then you've killed a man," added Challoner, as if he still could not quite believe. "And I'm to take you back to the woman. That's the funny thing about it. You're going back to her, and if she says kill you—" He dropped Miki's forefeet and went on to the cabin. At the threshold a low growl rose in Miki's throat. Challoner laughed and opened the door. They went in, and the dog's growl was a menacing snarl. Challoner had left his lamp burning low, and in the light of it he saw Henri Durant and Grouse Piet waiting for him. He turned up the wick and nodded. "Good evening. Pretty late for a call, isn't it?" Grouse Piet's stolid face did not change its expression. It struck Challoner, as he glanced at him, that in head and shoulders he bore a grotesque resemblance to a walrus. Durant's eyes were dully ablaze. His face was swollen where Challoner had struck him. Miki, stiffened to the hardness of a knot, and still snarling under his breath, had crawled under Challoner's bunk. Durant pointed to him. "We've come after that dog," he said. "You can't have him, Durant," replied Challoner, trying hard to make himself appear at ease in a situation that sent a chill up his back. As he spoke he was making up his mind why Grouse Piet had come with Durant. They were giants, both of them. More than that, monsters. Instinctively he had faced them, with the small table between them. "I'm sorry I lost my temper out there," he continued. "I shouldn't have struck you, Durant. It wasn't your fault. And I apologize. But the dog is mine. I lost him over in the Jackson's Knee country, and if Jacques Le Beau caught him in a trap and sold him to you, he sold a dog that didn't belong to him. I'm willing to pay you back what you gave for him, just to be fair. How much was it?" Grouse Piet had risen to his feet. Durant came to the opposite edge of the table and leaned over it. Challoner wondered how a single blow had knocked him down. "No, he is not for sale." Durant's voice was low, so low that it seemed to choke him to get it out. It was filled with a repressed hatred. Challoner saw the great cords of his knotted hands bulging under the skin as he gripped the edge of the table. "Monsieur, we have come for that dog. Will you let us take him?" "I will pay you back what you gave for him, Durant. I will add to the price." "No, he is mine. Will you give him back now?" "No." Scarcely was the word out of his mouth when Durant flung his whole weight and strength against the table. Challoner had not expected the move, just yet. With a bellow of rage and hatred Durant was upon him, and under the weight of the giant he crashed to the floor. With them went the table and lamp. There was a vivid splutter of flame and the cabin was in darkness, except where the moonlight flooded through the one window. Challoner had looked for something different. He had expected Durant to threaten before he acted, and, sizing up the two of them, he had decided to reach the edge of his bunk during the discussion. Under the pillow was his revolver. It was too late now. Durant was on him, fumbling in the darkness for his throat, and as he flung one arm upward to get a hook around the Frenchman's neck, he heard Grouse Piet throw the table back. The next instant they were rolling in the moonlight on the floor, and Challoner caught a glimpse of Grouse Piet's huge bulk bending over them. Durant's head was twisted under his arm, but one of the giant's hands had reached his throat. The half-breed saw this, and he cried out something in a guttural voice. With a tremendous effort Challoner rolled himself and his adversary out of the patch of light into darkness again. Durant's thick neck cracked. Again Grouse Piet called out in that guttural, questioning voice. Challoner put every ounce of his energy into the crook of his arm, and Durant did not answer. Then the weight of Grouse Piet fell upon them, and his great hands groped for Challoner's neck. His thick fingers found Durant's beard first, then fumbled for Challoner and got their hold. 10 seconds of their terrific grip would have broken his neck, but the fingers never closed. A savage cry of agony burst from Grouse Piet's lips, and with that cry, ending almost in a scream, came the snap of great jaws and the rending snarl of fangs in the darkness. Durant heard, and with a great heave of his massive body he broke free from Challoner's grip and leaped to his feet. In a flash Challoner was at his bunk, facing his enemies with the revolver in his hand. Everything had happened quickly. Scarcely more than a minute had passed since the overturning of the table, and now, in the moment when the situation had turned in his favour, A sudden swift and sickening horror seized upon Challoner. Bloody and terrible there rose before him the one scene he had witnessed that day in the big cage where Miki and the wolf dog had fought. And there, in that darkness of the cabin, he heard a moaning cry and the crash of a body to the floor. "Miki! Miki!" he cried. "Here! Here!" He dropped his revolver and sprang to the door, flinging it wide open. "For God's sake, get out!" he cried. "Get out!" A bulk dashed past him into the night. He knew it was Durant. Then he leaped to the dark shadows on the floor and dug his two hands into the loose hide at the back of Miki's neck, dragging him back and shouting his name. He saw Grouse Piet crawling toward the door. He saw him rise to his feet, silhouetted for a moment against the starlight, and stagger out into the night. And then he felt Miki's weight slinking down to the floor, and under his hands the dog's muscles grew limp and saggy. For 2 or 3 minutes he continued to kneel beside him before he closed the cabin door and lighted another lamp. He set up the overturned table and placed the lamp on it. Miki had not moved. He lay flat on his belly, his head between his forepaws, looking up at Challoner with a mute appeal in his eyes. Challoner reached out his two arms. "Miki!" In an instant Miki was up against him, his forefeet against his breast, and with his arms about the dog's shoulders Challoner's eyes took in the floor. On it were wet splashes and bits of torn clothing. His arms closed more tightly. "Miki, old boy, I'm much obliged," he said. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. The next morning Challoner's outfit of 3 teams and 4 men left north and west for the Reindeer Lake country on the journey to his new post at the mouth of the Cochrane. An hour later Challoner struck due west with a light sledge and a 5-dog team for the Jackson's Knee. Behind him followed one of MacDonald's Indians with the team that was to bring Nanette to Fort O' God. He saw nothing more of Durant and Grouse Piet, and accepted MacDonald's explanation that they had undoubtedly left the post shortly after their assault upon him in the cabin. No doubt their disappearance had been hastened by the fact that a patrol of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police on its way to York Factory was expected at Fort O' God that day. Not until the final moment of departure was Miki brought from the cabin and tied to the G-bar of Challoner's sledge. When he saw the 5 dogs squatted on their haunches he grew rigid, and the old snarl rose in his throat. Under Challoner's quieting words he quickly came to understand that these beasts were not enemies, and from a rather suspicious toleration of them he very soon began to take a new sort of interest in them. It was a friendly team, bred in the South and without the wolf strain. Events had come to pass so swiftly and so vividly in Miki's life during the past 24 hours that for many miles after they left Fort O' God his senses were in an unsettled state of anticipation. His brain was filled with a jumble of strange and thrilling pictures. Very far away, and almost indistinct, were the pictures of things that had happened before he was made a prisoner by Jacques Le Beau. Even the memory of Neewa was fading under the thrill of events at Nanette's cabin and at Fort O' God. The pictures that blazed their way across his brain now were of men, and dogs, and many other things that he had never seen before. His world had suddenly transformed itself into a host of Henri Durants and Grouse Piets and Jacques Le Beaus, two-legged beasts who had clubbed him and half killed him, and who had made him fight to keep the life in his body. He had tasted their blood in his vengeance, and he watched for them now. The pictures told him they were everywhere. He could imagine them as countless as the wolves, and as he had seen them crowded around the big cage in which he had slain the wolf dog. In all of this excited and distorted world there was only one Challoner, and one Nanette, and one baby. All else was a chaos of uncertainty and of dark menace. Twice, when the Indian came up close behind them, Miki whirled about with a savage snarl. Challoner watched him and understood. Of the pictures in his brain, one stood out above all others, definite and unclouded, and that was the picture of Nanette. Yes, even above Challoner himself. There lived in him the consciousness of her gentle hands, her sweet soft voice, the perfume of her hair and clothes and body, the woman of her. And a part of the woman, as the hand is a part of the body, was the baby. It was this part of Miki that Challoner could not understand, and which puzzled him when they made camp that night. He sat for a long time beside the fire, trying to bring back the old comradeship of the days of Miki's puppyhood. But he only partly succeeded. Miki was restive. Every nerve in his body seemed on edge. Again and again he faced the west, and always when he sniffed the air in that direction there came a low whine in his throat. That night, with doubt in his heart, Challoner fastened him near the tent with a tough rope of babiche. For a long time after Challoner had gone to bed, Miki sat on his haunches close to the spruce to which he was fastened. It must have been 10 o'clock, and the night was so still that the snap of a dying ember in the fire was like the crack of a whip to his ears. Miki's eyes were wide open and alert. Near the slowly burning logs, wrapped in his thick blankets, he could make out the motionless form of the Indian, asleep. Back of him the sledge dogs had wallowed their beds in the snow and were silent. The moon was almost straight overhead, and a mile or two away a wolf pointed his muzzle to the radiant glow of it and howled. The sound, like a distant calling voice, added new fire to the growing thrill in Miki's blood. He turned in the direction of the wailing voice. He wanted to call back. He wanted to throw up his head and cry out to the forests and the moon and the starlit sky. But only his jaws clicked, and he looked at the tent in which Challoner was sleeping. He dropped down upon his belly in the snow. But his head was still alert and listening. The moon had already begun its westward decline. The fire burned out until the logs were only a dull and slumbering glow. The hand of Challoner's watch passed midnight, and still Miki was wide-eyed and restless in the thrill of the thing that was upon him. And then, at last, the call that was coming to him from out of the night became his master, and he gnawed the babiche in two. It was the call of the woman, of Nanette and the baby. In his freedom Miki sniffed at the edge of Challoner's tent. His back sagged. His tail drooped. He knew that in this hour he was betraying the master for whom he had waited so long, and who had lived so vividly in his dreams. It was not reasoning, but an instinctive oppression of fact. He would come back. That conviction burned dully in his brain. But now, tonight, he must go. He slunk off into the darkness. With the stealth of a fox, he made his way between the sleeping dogs. Not until he was a quarter of a mile from the camp did he straighten out, and then a gray and fleeting shadow he sped westward under the light of the moon. There was no hesitation in the manner of his going. Free of the pain of his wounds, strong-limbed, deep-lunged as the strongest wolf of the forests, he went on tirelessly. Rabbits bobbing out of his path did not make him pause. Even the strong scent of a fisher cat almost under his nose did not swerve him a foot from his trail. Through swamp and deep forest, over lake and stream, across open barren and charred burns, his unerring sense of orientation led him on. Once he stopped to drink where the swift current of a creek kept the water open. Even then he gulped in haste and shot on. The moon drifted lower and lower until it sank into oblivion. The stars began to fade away. The little ones went out, and the big ones grew sleepy and dull. A great snow-ghostly gloom settled over the forest world. In the 6 hours between midnight and dawn he covered 35 miles. And then he stopped. Dropping on his belly beside a rock at the crest of a ridge, he watched the birth of day. With drooling jaws and panting breath he rested, until at last the dull gold of the winter sun began to paint the eastern sky. And then came the first bars of vivid sunlight, shooting over the eastern ramparts as guns flashed from behind their battlements, and Miki rose to his feet and surveyed the morning wonder of his world. Behind him was Fort O' God, 50 miles away. Ahead of him the cabin, 20. It was the cabin he faced as he went down from the ridge. As the miles between him and the cabin grew fewer and fewer, he felt again something of the oppression that had borne upon him at Challoner's tent. And yet it was different. He had run his race. He had answered the call. And now, at the end, he was seized by a fear of what his welcome would be. For at the cabin he had killed a man, and the man had belonged to the woman. His progress became more hesitating. Mid-forenoon found him only half a mile from the home of Nanette and the baby. His keen nostrils caught the faint tang of smoke in the air. He did not follow it up, but circled like a wolf, coming up stealthily and uncertainly until at last he looked out into the little clearing where a new world had come into existence for him. He saw the sapling cage in which Jacques Le Beau had kept him a prisoner. The door of that cage was still open, as Durant had left it after stealing him. He saw the ploughed up snow where he had leaped upon the man brute, and he whined. He was facing the cabin door, and the door was wide open. He could see no life, but he could smell it, and smoke was rising from the chimney. He slunk across the open. In the manner of his going there was an abject humiliation, a plea for mercy if he had done wrong, a prayer to the creatures he worshipped that he might not be driven away. He came to the door and peered in. The room was empty. Nanette was not there. Then his ears shot forward and his body grew suddenly tense, and he listened to a soft cooing sound that was coming from the crib. He swallowed hard. The faintest whine rose in his throat, and his claws clicked, clicked, clicked across the floor, and he thrust his great head over the side of the little bed. The baby was there. With his warm tongue he kissed it, just once, and then with another deep breath lay down on the floor. He heard footsteps. Nanette came in with her arms filled with blankets. She carried these into the smaller room and returned before she saw him. For a moment she stared. Then, with a strange little cry, she ran to him. And once more he felt her arms about him, and he cried like a puppy with his muzzle against her breast, and Nanette laughed and sobbed, and in the crib the baby kicked and squealed and thrust her tiny moccasined feet up into the air. "Au tapwamukon." When the devil goes, heaven comes in, say the Crees. And with the death of Le Beau, her husband, the devil had gone out of life for Nanette. She was more beautiful than ever. Heaven was in the dark, pure glow of her eyes. She was no longer like a dog under the club and the whip of a brute, and in the rebirth of her soul she was glorious. Youth had come back to her, freed from the yoke of oppression. She was happy, happy with her baby, with freedom, with the sun and the stars shining for her again, and with new hope, the greatest star of all. Again on the night of that first day of his return, Miki crept up to her when she was brushing her glorious hair. He loved to put his muzzle in it. He loved the sweet scent of it. He loved to put his head on her knees and feel it smothering him. And Nanette hugged him tight, even as she hugged the baby, for it was Miki who had brought her freedom, and hope, and life. What had passed was no longer a tragedy. It was justice. God had sent Miki to do for her what a father or a brother would have done. And the second night after that, when Challoner came early in the darkness, it happened that Nanette had her hair down in that same way, and Challoner, seeing her thus, with the lamp glow shining in her eyes, felt that the world had taken a sudden swift turn under his feet, that through all his years he had been working forward to this hour. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. With the coming of Challoner to the cabin of Nanette Le Beau, there was no longer a shadow of gloom in the world for Miki. He did not reason out the wonder of it, nor did he have a foreboding for the future. It was the present in which he lived, the precious hours in which all the creatures he had ever loved were together. And yet, away back in his memory of those things that had grown deep in his soul, was the picture of Neewa, the bear. Neewa, his chum, his brother, his fighting comrade of many battles, and he thought of the cold and snow-smothered cavern at the top of the ridge, in which Neewa had buried himself in that long and mysterious sleep that was so much like death. But it was in the present that he lived. The hours lengthened themselves out into days, and still Challoner did not go, nor did Nanette leave with the Indian for Fort O' God. The Indian returned with a note from MacDonnell in which Challoner told the factor that something was the matter with the baby's lungs, and that she could not travel until the weather, which was intensely cold, grew warmer. He asked that the Indian be sent back with certain supplies. In spite of the terrific cold which followed the birth of the new year, Challoner had put up his tent in the edge of the timber 100 yards from the cabin, and Miki divided his time between the cabin and the tent. For him they were glorious days, and for Challoner... In a way Miki saw, though it was impossible for him to comprehend. As the days lengthened into a week, and the week into 2, there was something in the glow of Nanette's eyes that had never been there before, and in the sweetness of her voice a new thrill, and in her prayers at night the thankfulness of a new and great joy. And then, one day, Miki looked up from where he was lying beside the baby's crib, and he saw Nanette in his master's arms, her face turned up to him, Her eyes filled with the glory of the stars, and Challoner was saying something which transformed her face into the face of an angel. Miki was puzzled. And he was more puzzled when Challoner came from Nanette to the crib and snuggled the baby up in his arms, and the woman, looking at them both for a moment with that wonderful look in her eyes, suddenly covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Half a snarl rose in Miki's throat, but in that moment Challoner had put his arm around Nanette too, and Nanette's arms were about him and the baby, and she was sobbing something which for the life of him Miki could make neither head nor tail of. And yet he knew that he must not snarl or spring. He felt the wonder thrill of the new thing that had come into the cabin. He gulped hard and looked. A moment or two later Nanette was on her knees beside him, and her arms were around him, just as they had been around the man. And Challoner was dancing like a boy, cooing to the baby in his arms. Then he, too, dropped down beside Miki, and cried, "My God, Miki, I've got a family!" And Miki tried to understand. That night, after supper, he saw Challoner unbraid Nanette's glorious hair and brush it. They laughed like two happy children. Miki tried still harder to understand. When Challoner went to go to his tent in the edge of the forest, he took Nanette in his arms and kissed her, and stroked her shining hair, and Nanette took his face between her hands and smiled and almost cried in her joy. After that Miki did understand. He knew that happiness had come to all who were in that cabin. Now that his world was settled, Miki took once more to hunting. The thrill of the trail came back to him, and wider grew his range from the cabin. Again he followed Le Beau's old trap line. But the traps were sprung now. He had lost a great deal of his old caution. He had grown fatter. He no longer scented danger in every whiff of the wind. It was in the third week of Challoner's stay at the cabin, the day which marked the end of the cold spell and the beginning of warm weather, that Miki came upon an old deadfall in a swamp a full 10 miles from the clearing. Le Beau had set it for lynx, but nothing had touched the bait, which was a chunk of caribou flesh, frozen solid as a rock. Curiously, Miki began smelling of it. He no longer feared danger. Menace had gone out of his world. He nibbled. He pulled. And the log crashed down to break his back. Only by a little did it fail. For 24 hours it held him helpless and crippled. Then, fighting through all those hours, he dragged himself out from under it. With the rising temperature a soft snow had fallen, covering all tracks and trails. Through this snow Miki dragged himself, leaving a path like that of an otter in the mud, for his hindquarters were helpless. His back was not broken. It was temporarily paralyzed by the blow and the weight of the log. He made it in the direction of the cabin, but every foot that he dragged himself was filled with agony, and his progress was so slow that at the end of an hour he had not gone more than a quarter of a mile. Another night found him less than 2 miles from the deadfall. He pulled himself under a shelter of brush and lay there until dawn. All through that day he did not move. The next, which was the 4th since he had left the cabin to hunt, the pain in his back was not so great. But he could pull himself through the snow only a few yards at a time. Again the good spirit of the forests favoured him, for in the afternoon he came upon the partly eaten carcass of a buck killed by the wolves. The flesh was frozen, but he gnawed at it ravenously. Then he found himself a shelter under a mass of fallen tree tops, and for 10 days thereafter he lay between life and death. He would have died had it not been for the buck. To the carcass he managed to drag himself, sometimes each day, and sometimes every other day, and kept himself from starving. It was the end of the second week before he could stand well on his feet. The 15th day he returned to the cabin. In the edge of the clearing there fell upon him slowly a foreboding of great change. The cabin was there. It was no different than it had been 15 days ago. But out of the chimney there came no smoke, and the windows were white with frost. About it the snow lay clean and white, like an unspotted sheet. He made his way hesitatingly across the clearing to the door. There were no tracks. Drifted snow was piled high over the sill. He whined and scratched at the door. There was no answer, and he heard no sound. He went back to the edge of the timber and waited. He waited all through that day, going occasionally to the cabin and smelling about it, to convince himself that he had not made a mistake. When darkness came, he hollowed himself out of bed in the fresh snow close to the door, and lay there all through the night. Day came again, gray and empty, and still there was no smoke from the chimney or sound from within the log walls, and at last he knew that Challoner and Nanette and the baby were gone. But he was hopeful. He no longer listened for the sound from within the cabin, but watched and listened for them to come from out of the forest. He made short quests, hunting now on this side and now on that of the cabin, sniffing futilely at the fresh and trackless snow, and pointing the wind for minutes at a time. In the afternoon, with a forlorn slouch to his body, he went deeper into the forest to hunt for a rabbit. When he had killed and eaten his supper, he returned again and slept a second night in the burrow beside the door. A third day and a third night he remained, and the third night he heard the wolves howling under a clear and star-filled sky, and from him there came his first cry, a yearning, grief-filled cry that rose wailingly out of the clearing, the entreaty for his master, for Nanette and the baby. It was not an answer to the wolves. In its note there was a trembling fear, the voicing of a thing that had grown into hopelessness. And now there settled upon him a loneliness greater than any loneliness he had ever known. Something seemed to whisper to his canine brain that all he had seen and felt had been but a dream, and that he was face to face with his old world again, its dangers, its vast and soul-breaking emptiness, its friendlessness, its ceaseless strife for existence. His instincts, dulled by the worship of what the cabin had held, became keenly alive. He sensed again the sharp thrill of danger which comes of aloneness, and his old caution fell upon him, so that the fourth day he slunk around the edge of the clearing like a wolf. The fifth night he did not sleep in the clearing, but found himself a windfall a mile back in the forest. That night he had strange and troubled dreams. They were not of Challoner, or of Nanette and the baby, nor were they of the fight and the unforgettable things he had seen at the post. His dreams were of a high and barren ridge smothered in deep snow, and of a cavern that was dark and deep. Again he was with his brother and comrade of days that were gone, Neewa the bear. He was trying to waken him, and he could feel the warmth of his body and hear his sleepy protesting grunts. And then, later, he was fighting again in the paradise of black currants, and with Neewa was running for his life from the enraged she bear who had invaded their coulee. When he awoke suddenly from out of these dreams he was trembling and his muscles were tense. He growled in the darkness. His eyes were round balls of searching fire. He whined softly and yearningly in that pit of gloom under the windfall, and for a moment or two he listened, for he thought that Neewa might answer. For a month after that night he remained near the cabin. At least once each day, and sometimes at night, he would return to the clearing. And more frequently he was thinking of Neewa. Early in March came the Tikiswau, the big thaw. For a week the sun shone without a cloud in the sky. The air was warm. The snow turned soft underfoot, and on the sunny sides of slopes and ridges it melted away into trickling streams, or rolled down in slides that were miniature avalanches. The world was vibrant with a new thrill. It pulsed with the growing heartbeat of spring, and in Miki's soul there arose slowly a new hope, a new impression, a new inspiration that was the thrilling urge of a wonderful instinct. Neewa would be waking now. It came to him at last like a voice which he could understand. The trickling music of the growing streams sang it to him. He heard it in the warm winds that were no longer filled with the blast of winter. He caught it in the new odours that were rising out of the earth. He smelled it in the dank, sweet perfume of the black wood soil. The thing thrilled him. And it called him. And he knew. Neewa would be waking now. He responded to the call. It was in the nature of things that no power less than physical force could hold him back. And yet he did not travel as he had travelled from Challoner's camp to the cabin of Nanette and the baby. There had been a definite object there, something to achieve, something to spur him on to an immediate fulfilment. Now the thing that drew him, at first, was an overpowering impulse, not a reality. For 2 or 3 days his trail westward was wandering and indefinite. Then it straightened out, and early in the morning of the 5th day he came from a deep forest into a plain, and across that plain he saw the ridge. For a long time he gazed over the level space before he went on. In his brain the pictures of Neewa were becoming clearer and clearer. After all, it seemed only yesterday or the day before that he had gone away from that ridge. Then it was smothered in snow, and a grey, terrible gloom had settled upon the earth. Now there was but little snow, and the sun was shining, and the sky was blue again. He went on, and sniffed along the foot of the ridge. He had not forgotten the way. He was not excited, because time had ceased to have definite import for him. Yesterday he had come down from that ridge, and today he was going back. He went straight to the mouth of Neewa's den, which was uncovered now, and thrust in his head and shoulders and sniffed. Ah, but that lazy rascal of a bear was a sleepy-head. He was still sleeping. Miki could smell him. Listening hard, he could hear him. He climbed over the low drift of snow that had packed itself in the neck of the cavern, and entered confidently into the darkness. He heard a soft, sleepy grunt and a great sigh. He almost stumbled over Neewa, who had changed his bed. Again Neewa grunted, and Miki whined. He ran his muzzle into Neewa's fresh new coat of spring fur and smelled his way to Neewa's ear. After all, it was only yesterday. And he remembered everything now. So he gave Neewa's ear a sudden sharp nip with his teeth, and then he barked in that low throaty way that Neewa had always understood. "Wake up, Neewa," it all said. "Wake up! The snow is gone, and it's fine out today. Wake up!" And Neewa, stretching himself, gave a great yawn. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. Meshaba, the old Cree, sat on the sunny side of a rock on the sunny side of a slope that looked up and down the valley. Meshaba, who many years ago had been called the Giant, was very old. He was so old that even the factor's books over at Fort O' God had no record of his birth, nor the post logs at Albany House or Cumberland House or Norway House or Fort Churchill. Perhaps farther north, at Lac La Biche, at old Fort Resolution, or at Fort McPherson, some trace of him might have been found. His skin was crinkled and weather-worn, like dry buckskin, and over his brown, thin face his hair fell to his shoulders, snow-white. His hands were thin, even his nose was thin with a thinness of age. But his eyes were still like dark garnets, and down through the greater part of a century their vision had come undimmed. They roved over the valley now. At Meshaba's back, a mile on the other side of the ridge, was the old trapper's cabin where he lived alone. The winter had been long and cold, and in his gladness at the coming of spring, Meshaba had come up to the ridge to bask in the sun and look out over the changing world. For an hour his eyes had traveled up and down the valley like the eyes of an old and wary hawk. The dark spruce and cedar forest edged in the far side of the valley. Between that and the ridge rolled the meadowy plain, still covered with melting snow in places, and in others bare and glowing, a dull green in the sunlight. From where he sat, Meshaba could also see a rocky scarp of the ridge that projected out into the plain 100 yards away. But this did not interest him, except that if it had not been in his line of vision, he could have seen a mile farther down the valley. In that hour of sphinx-like watching, while the smoke curled slowly up from his black pipe, Meshaba had seen life. Half a mile from where he was sitting, a band of caribou had come out of the timber and wandered into a less distant patch of low bush. They had not thrilled his old blood with the desire to kill, for there was already a fresh carcass hung up at the back of his cabin. Still farther away he had seen a hornless moose, so grotesque in its spring ugliness that the parchment-like skin of his face had cracked for half an instant in a smile, and out of him had come a low and appreciative grunt. For Meshaba, in spite of his age, still had a sense of humor left. Once he had seen a wolf and twice a fox, and now his eyes were on an eagle high over his head. Meshaba would not have shot that eagle, for year after year it had come down through time with him, and it was always there soaring in the sun when spring came. So Meshaba grunted as he watched it, and was glad that Upisk had not died during the winter. "Kata I Ati Sisu," he whispered to himself, a glow of superstition in his fiery eyes. "We have lived long together, and it is fated that we die together, O Upisk. The spring has come for us many times, and soon the black winter will swallow us up forever." His eyes shifted slowly, and then they rested on the scarp of the ridge that shut out his vision. His heart gave a sudden thump in his body. His pipe fell from his mouth to his hand, and he stared without moving, stared like a thing of rock. On a flat sunlit shelf not more than 80 or 90 yards away stood a young black bear. In the warm glow of the sunlight the bear's spring coat shone like polished jet. But it was not the sudden appearance of the bear that amazed Meshaba. It was the fact that another animal was standing shoulder to shoulder with Wakayoo, and that it was not a brother bear, but a huge wolf. Slowly one of his thin hands rose to his eyes, and he wiped away what he thought must surely be a strange something that was fooling his vision. In all his 80 years and odd he had never known a wolf to be thus friendly with a bear. Nature had made them enemies. Nature had foredoomed their hatred to be the deepest hatred of the forests. Therefore, for a space, Mishaba doubted his eyes. But in another moment he saw that the miracle had truly come to pass. For the wolf turned broadside to him, and it was a wolf, a huge, big-boned beast that stood as high as the shoulders of Wakayoo, the bear. A great beast, with a great head, and— It was then that Mishaba's heart gave another thump. For the tail of a wolf is big and bushy in the springtime, and the tail of this beast was as bare of hair as a beaver's tail. "Oh, Nimoosh!" gasped Mishaba, under his breath. "A dog!" He seemed to draw slowly into himself, slinking backward. His rifle stood just out of reach on the other side of the rock. At the other end of that 80 or 90 yards, Neewa and Miki stood blinking in the bright sunlight, with the mouth of the cavern in which Neewa had slept so many months just behind them. Miki was puzzled. Again it seemed to him that it was only yesterday, and not months ago, that he had left Neewa in that den, sleeping his lazy head off. And now that he had returned to him after his own hard winter in the forests, he was astounded to find Neewa so big. For Neewa had grown steadily through his 4 months' nap, and he was half again as big as when he went to sleep. Could Miki have spoken Cree, and had Mishaba given him the opportunity, he might have explained the situation. "You see, Mr. Indian," he might have said, "this dub of a bear and I have been pals from just about the time we were born. A man named Challoner tied us together first when Neewa there was just about as big as your head, and we did a lot of scrapping before we got properly acquainted. Then we got lost, and after that we hitched up like brothers. And we had a lot of fun and excitement all through last summer, until at last, when the cold weather came, Neewa hunted up this hole in the ground, and the lazy cuss went to sleep for all winter. I won't mention what happened to me during the winter. It was a plenty. So this spring I had a hunch it was about time for Neewa to get the cobwebs out of his fool head and come back. And here we are. But tell me this, what makes Neewa so big?" It was at least that thought, the bigness of Neewa, that was filling Miki's head at the present moment. And Mishaba, in place of listening to an explanation, was reaching for his rifle, while Neewa, with his brown muzzle sniffing the wind, was gathering in a strange smell. Of the three, Neewa saw nothing to be wondered at in the situation itself. When he had gone to sleep 4½ months ago, Miki was at his side, and today, when he awoke, Miki was still at his side. The 4½ months meant nothing to him. Many times he and Miki had gone to sleep, and had awakened together. For all the knowledge he had of time, it might have been only last night that he had fallen asleep. The one thing that made Neewa uneasy now was that strange odour he had caught in the air. Instinctively he seized upon it as a menace, at least as something that he would rather not smell than smell. So he turned away with a warning woof to Miki. When Mishaba peered around the edge of the rock, expecting an easy shot, he caught only a flash of the two as they were disappearing. He fired quickly. To Miki and Neewa the report of the rifle and the moaning whir of the bullet over their backs recalled memories of a host of things, and Neewa settled down to that hump-backed, flat-eared flight of his that kept Miki pegging along at a brisk pace for at least a mile. Then Neewa stopped, puffing audibly. Inasmuch as he had had nothing to eat for a third of a year, and was weak from long inactivity, the run came within an ace of putting him out of business. It was several minutes before he could gather his wind sufficiently to grunt. Miki, meanwhile, was carefully smelling of him from his rump to his muzzle. There was apparently nothing missing, for he gave a delighted little yap at the end, and in spite of his size and the dignity of increased age, he began frisking about Neewa in a manner emphatically expressive of his joy at his comrade's awakening. "It's been a deuce of a lonely winter, Neewa, and I'm tickled to death to see you on your feet again," his antics said. "What'll we do? Go for a hunt?" This seemed to be the thought in Neewa's mind, for he headed straight up the valley until they came to an open fen, where he proceeded to quest about for a dinner of roots and grass, and as he searched he grunted in his old companionable, cubbish way, and Miki, hunting with him, found that once more the loneliness had gone out of his world. Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 25. To Miki and Neewa, especially Neewa, there seemed nothing extraordinary in the fact that they were together again, and that their comradeship was resumed. Although during his months of hibernation Neewa's body had grown, his mind had not changed its memories or its pictures. It had not passed through a mess of stirring events, such as had made the winter a thrilling one for Miki, and so it was Neewa who accepted the new situation most casually. He went on feeding as if nothing at all unusual had happened during the past 4 months, and after the edge had gone from his first hunger, he fell into his old habit of looking to Miki for leadership. And Miki fell into the old ways as though only a day or a week and not 4 months had lapsed in their brotherhood. It is possible that he tried mightily to tell Neewa what had happened. At least he must have had that desire, to let him know in what a strange way he had found his old master, Challoner, and how he had lost him again. And also how he had found the woman, Nanette, and the little baby, Nanette, and how for a long time he had lived with them and loved them as he had never loved anything else on earth. It was the old cabin, far to the north and east, that drew him now, the cabin in which Nanette and the baby had lived, and it was toward this cabin that he lured Neewa during the first 2 weeks of their hunting. They did not travel quickly, largely because of Neewa's voracious spring appetite and the fact that it consumed 9/10 of his waking hours to keep full on such provender as roots and swelling buds and grass. During the first week Miki grew either hopeless or disgusted in his hunting. One day he killed 5 rabbits, and Neewa ate 4 of them and grunted piggishly for more. If Miki had stood amazed and appalled at Neewa's appetite in the days of their cubhood and puppyhood a year ago, he was more than astounded now, for in the matter of food Neewa was a bottomless pit. On the other hand, he was jollier than ever, and in their wrestling matches he was almost more than a match for Miki, being nearly again as heavy. He very soon acquired the habit of taking advantage of this superiority of weight, and at unexpected moments he would hop on Miki and pin him to the ground, his fat body smothering him like a huge soft cushion, and his arms holding him until at times Miki could scarcely squirm. Now and then, hugging him in this embrace, he would roll over and over, both of them snarling and growling as though in deadly combat. This play, though he was literally the underdog, delighted Miki until one day they rolled over the edge of a deep ravine and crashed in a dog and bear avalanche to the bottom. After that, for a long time, Neewa did not roll with his victim. Whenever Miki wanted to end a bout, however, all he had to do was give Neewa a sharp nip with his long fangs, and the bear would uncoil himself and hop to his feet like a spring. He had a most serious respect for Miki's teeth. But Miki's greatest moments of joy were where Neewa stood up man fashion. Then was a real tussle. And his greatest hour of disgust were when Neewa stretched himself out in a tree for a nap. It was the beginning of the third week before they came one day to the cabin. There was no change in it, and Miki's body sagged disconsolately as he and Neewa looked at it from the edge of the clearing. No smoke, no sign of life, and the window was broken now, probably by an inquisitive bear or a wolverine. Miki went to the window and stood up to it, sniffing inside. The smell was still there, so faint that he could only just detect it. But that was all. The big room was empty except for the stove, a table, and a few bits of rude furniture. All else was gone. 3 or 4 times during the next half hour Miki stood up at the window, and at last Neewa, urged by his curiosity, did likewise. He also detected the faint odour that was left in the cabin. He sniffed at it for a long time. It was like the smell he had caught the day he came out of his den, and yet different. It was fainter, more elusive, and not so unpleasant. For a month thereafter Miki insisted on hunting in the vicinity of the cabin, held there by the pull of the thing which he could neither analyze nor quite understand. Neewa accepted the situation good-naturedly for a time. Then he lost patience and surrendered himself to a grouch for 3 whole days during which he wandered at his own sweet will. To preserve the alliance, Miki was compelled to follow him. Berry time, early July, found them 60 miles north and west of the cabin, in the edge of the country where Neewa was born. But there were few berries that summer of Bibi Nakumgira, the summer of drought and fire. As early as the middle of July a thin grey film began to hover in palpitating waves over the forests. For 3 weeks there had been no rain. Even the nights were hot and dry. Each day the factors at their posts looked out with anxious eyes over their domains, and by the 1st of August every post had a score of half-breeds and Indians patrolling the trails on the watch for fire. In their cabins and teepees the forest dwellers who had not gone to pass the summer at the posts waited and watched. Each morning and noon and night they climbed tall trees and peered through that palpitating grey film for a sign of smoke. For weeks the wind came steadily from the south and west, parched as though swept over the burning sands of a desert. Berries dried up on the bushes. The fruit of the mountain ash shriveled on its stems. Creeks ran dry. Swamps turned into baked peat, and the poplar leaves hung wilted and lifeless, too limp to rustle in the breeze. Only once or twice in a lifetime does the forest dweller see poplar leaves curl up and die like that, baked to death in the summer sun. It is Kiskawahun, the danger signal. Not only the warning of possible death in a holocaust of fire, but the omen of poor hunting and trapping in the winter to come. Miki and Neewa were in a swamp country when the 5th of August came. In the lowland it was sweltering. Neewa's tongue hung from his mouth, and Miki was panting as they made their way along a black and sluggish stream that was like a great ditch and as dead as the day itself. There was no visible sun, but a red and lurid glow filled the sky, the sun struggling to fight its way through the smoldering film that had grown thicker over the earth. Because they were in a pocket, a sweep of tangled country lower than the surrounding country, Neewa and Miki were not caught in this blackening cloud. 5 miles away they might have heard the thunder of cloven hoofs and the crash of heavy bodies in their flight before the deadly menace of fire. As it was, they made their way slowly through the parched swamp, so that it was midday when they came out of the edge of it and up through a green fringe of timber to the top of a ridge. Before this hour neither had passed through the horror of a forest fire. But it seized upon them now. It needed no past experience. The cumulative instinct of 1,000 generations leaped through their brains and bodies. Their world was in the grip of Iskootaw, the fire devil. To the south and the east and the west it was buried in a pall like the darkness of night, and out of the far edge of the swamp through which they had come they caught the first livid spurts of flame. From that direction, now that they were out of the pocket, they felt a hot wind, and with that wind came a dull and rumbling roar that was like the distant moaning of a cataract. They waited and watched, struggling to get their bearings, their minds fighting for a few moments in the gigantic process of changing instinct into reasoning and understanding. Neewa, being a bear, was afflicted with the near-sightedness of his breed, and he could see neither the black tornado of smoke bearing down upon them nor the flames leaping out of the swamp. But he could smell, and his nose was twisted into 100 wrinkles, and even ahead of Miki he was ready for flight. But Miki, whose vision was like a hawk's, stood as if fascinated. The roaring grew more distinct. It seemed on all sides of them. But it was from the south that there came the first storm of ash rushing noiselessly ahead of the fire, and after that the smoke. It was then that Miki turned with a strange whine, but it was Neewa now who took the lead, Neewa, whose forebears had 10,000 times run this same wild race with death in the centuries since their world was born. He did not need the keenness of far vision now. He knew. He knew what was behind, and what was on either side, and where the one trail to safety lay. And in the air he felt and smelled the thing that was death. Twice Miki made efforts to swing their course into the east, but Neewa would have none of it. With flattened ears he went on north. 3 times Miki stopped to turn and face the galloping menace behind them, but never for an instant did Neewa pause. Straight on, north, 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 north to the higher lands, the big waters, the open plains. They were not alone. A caribou sped past them with the swiftness of the wind itself. "Fast, fast, fast!" Neewa's instinct cried. "But endure! For the caribou, speeding even faster than the fire, will fall of exhaustion shortly and be eaten up by the flames. Fast, but endure!" And steadily, stoically, at his loping gait Neewa led on. A bull moose swung half across their trail from the west, wind gone and panting as though his throat were cut. He was badly burned, and running blindly into the eastern wall of fire. Behind and on either side, where the flames were rushing on with the pitiless ferocity of Hunnish regiments, the harvest of death was a vast and shuddering reality. In hollow logs, under windfalls, in the thick tree tops, and in the earth itself, the smaller things of the wilderness sought their refuge, and died. Rabbits became leaping balls of flame, then lay shriveled and black. The marten were baked in their trees. Fishers and mink and ermine crawled into the deepest corners of the windfalls and died there by inches. Owls fluttered out of their treetops, staggered for a few moments in the fiery air, and fell down into the heart of the flame. No creature made a sound, except the porcupines, and as they died they cried like little children. In the green spruce and cedar timber, heavy with the pitch that made their thick tops spurt into flame like a sea of explosive, the fire rushed on with a tremendous roar. From it, in a straight race, there was no escape for man or beast. Out of that world of conflagration there might have risen one great yearning cry to heaven. Water! 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 Wherever there was water there was also hope and life. Breed and blood and wilderness feuds were forgotten in their great hour of peril. Every lake became a haven of refuge. To such a lake came Neewa, guided by an unerring instinct and sense of smell sharpened by the rumble and roar of the storm of fire behind them. Miki had lost himself. His senses were dulled. His nostrils caught no scent but that of a world in flames. So, blindly, he followed his comrade. The fire was enveloping the lake along its western shore, and its water was already thickly tenanted. It was not a large lake, and almost round. Its diameter was not more than 200 yards. Farther out, a few of them swimming, but most of them standing on bottom with only their heads out of the water, were a score of caribou and moose. Many other short-legged creatures were swimming aimlessly, turning this way and that, paddling their feet only enough to keep afloat. On the shore where Neewa and Miki paused was a huge porcupine, chattering and chuckling foolishly, as if scolding all things in general for having disturbed him at dinner. Then he took to the water. A little farther up the shore a fisher cat and a fox hugged close to the water line, hesitating to wet their precious fur until death itself snapped at their heels. And as if to bring fresh news of this death, a second fox dragged himself wearily out on the shore, as limp as a wet rag after his swim from the opposite shore, where the fire was already leaping in a wall of flame. And as this fox swam in, hoping to find safety, an old bear twice as big as Neewa, crashed panting from the undergrowth, plunged into the water, and swam out. Smaller things were creeping and crawling and slinking along the shore. Little red-eyed ermine, marten and mink, rabbits, squirrels and squeaking gophers, and a horde of mice. And at last, with these things which he would have devoured so greedily running about him, Neewa waded slowly out into the water. Miki followed until he was submerged to his shoulders. Then he stopped. The fire was close now, advancing like a racehorse. Over the protecting barrier of thick timber drove the clouds of smoke and ash. Swiftly the lake became obliterated, and now out of that awful chaos of blackness and smoke and heat there rose strange and thrilling cries. The bleating of a moose calf that was doomed to die, and the bellowing, terror-filled response of its mother, the agonized howling of a wolf, the terrified barking of a fox, and over all else the horrible screaming of a pair of loons whose home had been transformed into a sea of flame. Through the thickening smoke and increasing heat Neewa gave his call to Miki as he began to swim, and with an answering whine Miki plunged after him, swimming so close to his big black brother that his muzzle touched the other's flank. In mid-lake Neewa did as the other swimming creatures were doing, paddled only enough to keep himself afloat. But for Miki, Big of bone and unassisted by a life preserver of fat, the struggle was not so easy. He was forced to swim to keep afloat. A dozen times he circled around Neewa, and then, with something of the situation driven upon him, he came up close to the bear and rested his forepaws on his shoulders. The lake was now encircled by a solid wall of fire. Blasts of flame shot up the pitch-laden trees and leaped for 50 feet into the blistering air. The roar of the conflagration was deafening. It drowned all sound that brute agony and death may have made. And its heat was terrific. For a few terrible minutes the air which Miki drew into his lungs was like fire itself. Neewa plunged his head under water every few seconds, but it was not Miki's instinct to do this. Like the wolf and the fox and the fisher cat and the lynx, it was his nature to die before completely submerging himself. Swift as it had come, the fire passed, and the walls of timber that had been green a few moments before were black and shriveled and dead, and sound swept on with the flame until it became once more only a low and rumbling murmur. To the black and smouldering shores the live things slowly made their way. Of all the creatures that had taken refuge in the lake, many had died. Chief of those were the porcupines. All had drowned. Close to the shore the heat was still intense, and for hours the earth was hot with smouldering fire. All the rest of that day and the night that followed, no living thing moved out of the shallow water. And yet no living thing thought to prey upon its neighbour. The great peril had made all of beasts kin. A little before dawn of the day following the fire, relief came. A deluge of rain fell, and when day broke and the sun shone through a murky heaven, there was left no sign of what the lake had been, except for the dead bodies that floated on its surface or lined its shores. The living things had returned into their desolated wilderness, and among them Neewa and Miki. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Nomads of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. For many days after the Great Fire, it was Neewa who took the lead. All their world was a black and lifeless desolation, and Miki would not have known which way to turn. Had it been a local fire of small extent, he would have wandered out of its charred path. But the conflagration had been immense. It had swept over a vast reach of country, and for half of the creatures who had saved themselves in the lakes and streams there was only a death by starvation left. But not for Neewa and his breed. Just as there had been no indecision in the manner and direction of his flight before the fire, so there was now no hesitation in the direction he chose to seek a live world again. It was due north and west, as straight as a die. If they came to a lake and went around it, Neewa would always follow the shore until he came directly opposite his trail on the other side of the lake, and then strike north and west again. He traveled steadily, not only by day but also by night, with only short intervals of rest, and the dawning of the second morning found Miki more exhausted than the bear. There were many evidences now that they had reached a point where the fire had begun to burn itself out. Patches of green timber were left standing, there were swamps unscathed by the flames, and here and there they came upon green patches of meadow. In the swamps and timber they feasted, for these oases in what had been a sea of flame were filled with food ready to be preyed upon and devoured. For the first time Neewa refused to stop, because there was plenty to eat. The sixth day they were 100 miles from the lake in which they had sought refuge from the fire. It was a wonderful country of green timber, of wide plains and of many lakes and streams, cut up by 1,000 usiyao (low ridges), which made the best of hunting. Because it was a country of many waters, with live streams running between the ridges and from lake to lake, it had not suffered from the drought like the country farther south. For a month Neewa and Miki hunted in their new paradise and became fat and happy again. It was in September that they came upon a strange thing in the edge of a swamp. At first Miki thought that it was a cabin, but it was a great deal smaller than any cabin he had known. It was not much larger than the cage of sapling in which Le Beau had kept him. But it was made of heavy logs, and the logs were notched so that nothing could knock them down. And these logs, instead of lying closely one on the other, had open spaces 6 or 8 inches wide between them. And there was a wide open door. From this strange contraption there came a strong odour of over-ripened fish. The smell repelled Miki, but it was a powerful attraction to Neewa, who persisted in remaining near it in spite of all Miki could do to drag him away. Finally, disgusted at his comrade's bad taste, Miki sulked off alone to hunt. It was some time after that before Neewa dared to thrust his head and shoulders through the opening. The smell of the fish made his little eyes gleam. Cautiously he stepped inside the queer-looking thing of logs. Nothing happened. He saw the fish, all he could eat, just on the other side of a sapling against which he must lean to reach them. He went deliberately to the sapling, leaned over, and then crash! He whirled about as if shot. There was no longer an opening where he had entered. The sapling trigger had released an overhead door, and Neewa was a prisoner. He was not excited, but accepted the situation quite coolly, probably having no doubt in his mind that somewhere there was an aperture between the logs large enough for him to squeeze through. After a few inquisitive sniffs, he proceeded to devour the fish. He was absorbed in his odoriferous feast when out of a clump of dwarf balsams a few yards away appeared an Indian. He quickly took in the situation, turned, and disappeared. Half an hour later this Indian ran into a clearing in which were the recently constructed buildings of a new post. He made for the company store. In the fur-carpeted office of this store a man was bending fondly over a woman. The Indian saw them as he entered and chuckled. "Sakahiwawin," the love couple. That was what they had already come to call them at Post Lac Bain. This man and woman who had given them a great feast when the missioner had married them not so very long ago. The man and the woman stood up when the Indian entered, and the woman smiled at him. She was beautiful. Her eyes were glowing, and there was the flush of a flower in her cheeks. The Indian felt the worship of her warm in his heart. "Oui, we have caught the bear," he said. "But it is Napow, a he bear. There is no cub, Iskwao Nanette." The white man chuckled. "Aren't we having the darndest luck getting you a cub for a house pet, Nanette?" he asked. "I'd have sworn this mother and her cub would have been easily caught. A he bear! We'll have to let him loose, Mutag. His pelt is good for nothing. Do you want to go with us and see the fun, Nanette?" She nodded, her little laugh filled with the joy of love and life. "Oui, it will be such fun to see him go." Challoner led the way, with an axe in his hand, and with him came Nanette, her hand in his. Mutag followed with his rifle, prepared for an emergency. From the thick screen of balsams Challoner peered forth, then made a hole through which Nanette might look at the cage and its prisoner. For a moment or two she held her breath as she watched Neewa pacing back and forth, very much excited now. Then she gave a little cry, and Challoner felt her fingers pinch his own sharply. Before he knew what she was about to do, she had thrust herself through the screen of balsams. Close to the log prison, faithful to his comrade in the hour of peril, lay Miki. He was exhausted from digging at the earth under the lower log, and he had not smelled or heard anything of the presence of others until he saw Nanette standing not 20 paces away. His heart leaped up into his panting throat. He swallowed, as though to get rid of a great lump. He stared. And then, with a sudden yearning whine, he sprang toward her. With a yell Challoner leaped out of the balsams with uplifted axe. But before the axe could fall, Miki was in Nanette's arms, and Challoner dropped his weapon with a gasp of amazement and one word: "Miki!" Mutag, looking on in stupid astonishment, saw both the man and the woman making a great fuss over a strange and wild-looking beast that looked as if it ought to be killed. They had forgotten the bear. And Miki, wildly joyous at finding his beloved master and mistress, had forgotten him also. It was a prodigious woof from Neewa himself that brought their attention to him. Like a flash, Miki was at the pen smelling of Neewa's snout between two of the logs, and with a great wagging of tail trying to make him understand what had happened. Slowly, with a thought born in his head that made him oblivious of all else but the big black brute in the pen, Challoner approached the trap. Was it possible that Miki could have made friends with any other bear than the cub of long ago? He drew in a deep breath as he looked at them. Neewa's brown-tipped nose was thrust between two of the logs, and Miki was licking it with his tongue. He held out a hand to Nanette, and when she came to him he pointed for a space without speaking. Then he said: "It is the cub, Nanette. You know, the cub I have told you about. They've stuck together all this time, ever since I killed the cub's mother a year and a half ago, and tied them together on a piece of rope. I understand now why Miki ran away from us when we were at the cabin. He went back to the bear. Today, if you strike northward from Le Pas and put your canoe in the Rat River or Grassberry waterways, and thence paddle and run with the current down the Reindeer River and along the east shore of Reindeer Lake, you will ultimately come to the Cochrane and Post Lac Bain. It is one of the most wonderful countries in all the Northland. 300 Indians, Breeds, and French come with their furs to Lac Bain. Not a soul among them, man, woman, or child, but knows the story of the tame bear of Lac Bain, the pet of L'Ange, the White Angel, the factor's wife. The bear wears a shining collar and roams at will in the company of a great dog, but, having grown huge and fat now, never wanders far from the post. And it is an unwritten law in all that country that the animal must not be harmed, and that no bear traps shall be set within 5 miles of the company buildings. Beyond that limit the bear never roams, and when it comes cold and he goes into his long sleep, he crawls into a deep, warm cavern that has been dug for him under the company storehouse. And with him, when the night comes, sleeps Miki the dog. The End. End of chapter 26. End of Nomads of the North by James Oliver Curwood. This recording has been by Roger Moline.